The night did not announce itself with thunder. It arrived quietly, wrapped in fog and obedience, moving through the narrow streets of Paris like a held breath. It was Friday, October 13th, 1307. Most of the city slept, unaware that history was about to fracture. Torches flickered against stone walls, their light trembling as armed men moved with rehearsed precision. Doors were marked, names were checked, orders were sealed with wax and silence. The men being hunted were not criminals hiding in shadows. They were knights, holy warriors, brothers of an order sworn to Christ, sanctioned by the Church itself, feared on battlefields and respected across kingdoms. For nearly 2 centuries, the Knights Templar had stood as the sword and shield of Christendom. Now, before dawn, they would be branded heretics. At the Temple fortress in Paris, the knock came hard and without warning. Jacques de Molay, Grand Master of the Order, was awake. He had spent the previous day attending a royal funeral, standing beside King Philip IV as a trusted ally. Nothing in his long life of war and faith had prepared him for what followed. When the doors were opened, royal soldiers flooded in, reading accusations that sounded unreal even as they echoed off sacred stone. Idolatry, blasphemy, secret rites, crimes so vile they could barely be spoken aloud. Across France, the same scene unfolded with terrifying coordination. Hundreds of Templars were seized in the same hour. Not a single warning had escaped. Not a single fortress had raised its banners in defense. It was as if the order, so disciplined and so powerful, had been frozen in place by something deeper than surprise, something closer to trust. By sunrise, the knights were in chains. For the people watching from windows and alleyways, confusion spread faster than understanding. These were the men who had defended pilgrims, financed kings, and fought wars in the name of the cross. They had prayed beside bishops, lent money to monarchs, died by the thousands in the sands of the Holy Land. How could such men suddenly be enemies of God? The charges, when they were later read aloud, felt deliberately shocking. The Templars were accused of denying Christ during initiation, of spitting on the cross, of worshipping a mysterious idol, of practicing obscene rituals behind closed doors. The words were chosen not to be proven, but to horrify. In a deeply religious world, heresy was not just a crime. It was a contagion. Yet beneath the surface of these accusations lay a deeper unease. Kings did not move with this level of precision on rumors alone. The Pope himself hesitated, uncertain and uneasy, but the machinery had already been set in motion. Something had changed. Something had shifted behind the walls of power. The arrests were only the beginning. Within days, the interrogations began. Cells filled with the smell of iron and fear. Ropes, racks, and fire were introduced not as tools of truth, but as instruments of compliance. Men who had endured battlefields broke under methods they had never imagined would be used by fellow Christians. Confessions emerged, contradictory and desperate. Some admitted to anything asked of them. Others refused, clinging to silence even as their bodies failed. To the outside world, these confessions appeared damning. To those who understood torture, they raised a darker question. What truth could survive such pain? As the weeks passed, whispers replaced certainty. If the Templars were innocent, why were so many confessing? If they were guilty, how had the Church not known for 200 years? And if the Church had known, why act now? The timing was impossible to ignore. King Philip IV of France was deeply in debt to the order. The Templars had effectively become Europe's first international bankers, safeguarding wealth, transferring funds, and financing wars. They answered to the Pope alone, not to kings. In a world built on hierarchy, this independence was dangerous. In a kingdom ruled by a monarch obsessed with control, it was intolerable. But money alone did not explain the ferocity of the accusations. Greed does not usually wear the mask of theology so convincingly. Something else had been invoked. Something that required total destruction, not reform. As documents were seized and properties confiscated, a troubling pattern emerged. The Church was not just dismantling an order. It was erasing memory. Records vanished. Archives were sealed. Testimonies that favored the Templars were ignored or quietly buried. What survived was carefully shaped, filtered through royal need and ecclesiastical fear. And yet, even as the fires burned, something refused to disappear. Some Templars recanted their confessions the moment they were removed from torture. Others stood before councils and calmly declared their innocence, knowing full well it would lead them back to the flames. These were not the actions of men protecting gold or status. They were the actions of men guarding something they believed was worth dying for. What could inspire such resolve? Rumors spread beyond France. In England, Scotland, and the German states, rulers hesitated. The accusations felt sudden, excessive. Investigations elsewhere produced far fewer confessions, and many Templars were quietly absolved. The narrative was cracking, but the damage had already been done. The image of heresy, once planted, was impossible to fully remove. As years dragged on, the trials became less about truth and more about closure. The Church needed an ending. The king needed an outcome. In 1312, under immense pressure, the Pope officially dissolved the order. No definitive guilt was declared. No innocence was restored. The Templars were simply erased. But erasure leaves shadows. On the final day, as Jacques de Molay stood bound to a stake on an island in the Seine, witnesses noted his composure. Flames rose, smoke curled into the Paris sky, and before the fire claimed him, he spoke words that would echo for generations. He called upon God to judge those who had wronged the order. Within a year, both the Pope and the king were dead. History would later argue whether this was coincidence or curse. But symbolism does not require belief to be powerful. What mattered more was what had been lost. Some claimed the Templars had possessed immense treasure, hidden away before the arrests. Others whispered of sacred relics, ancient knowledge, or forbidden texts uncovered beneath the ruins of Jerusalem. Most historians dismissed these stories as fantasy. And yet, fantasy does not emerge from nothing. Legends grow where questions remain unanswered. Why destroy an order so completely if its only crime was wealth? Why silence men who could have been imprisoned, reformed, or absorbed into other institutions? Why burn knowledge instead of correcting it? The Church insisted it was protecting the faith. But history has shown that institutions often fear ideas more than armies. A sword can be broken. Gold can be seized. But a belief once planted has a way of surviving fire. As the smoke cleared and the world moved on, the Templars faded from official memory, reduced to footnotes and cautionary tales. Yet their symbols endured, their myths spread, their unanswered questions multiplied, and somewhere beneath the layers of accusation, confession, and ash, a forbidden secret waited, not for proof, but for someone willing to ask why it had been condemned so completely. Because whatever the Templars knew, it was dangerous enough to make the most powerful institution in medieval Europe choose destruction over debate. And that is where the Real story begins. Long before chains and accusations, before trials and fire, the story of the Templars began in a world still bleeding from war. Jerusalem, in the early years of the 12th century, was a city caught between victory and fear. The First Crusade had ended with Christian banners raised over sacred ground, but peace did not follow. The roads were unsafe, the countryside hostile, and pilgrims who arrived full of devotion often never reached the holy sites they had crossed continents to see. Into this fragile and violent landscape stepped a small group of men who called themselves poor. They were knights by training, warriors by necessity, but monks by vow. Around the year 1119, a French noble named Hugues de Payens and a handful of companions pledged themselves to a singular mission: to protect pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem. They owned little, wore simple clothes, and slept where they could. Their horses were few, their numbers insignificant. In a world of armies and empires, they were almost invisible. Yet from the beginning there was something unusual about them. These men did not answer to a local lord. They did not demand payment for their protection. They lived under strict discipline, bound by vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Their lives were structured around prayer and vigilance, silence and readiness. To the weary pilgrims they escorted, they seemed like guardians sent by Providence itself. The king of Jerusalem, Baldwin II, took notice. He offered them lodging in a part of his palace built atop the ancient Temple Mount. This detail would later become legend, but at the time it seemed practical. Space was limited, and the knights needed a base of operations. They accepted without protest, settling into quarters that once stood above the ruins of Solomon's temple. It was here, beneath layers of sacred history, that the identity of the order began to form. For nearly a decade, the group existed in near obscurity. They had no official recognition from the church, no formal rule, no widespread support. Their survival depended on reputation alone. But that reputation grew. Stories spread of knights who did not flee, who stood their ground, who fought not for plunder but for protection. In a brutal age, restraint was its own form of power. Everything changed when they caught the attention of a man who understood the language of influence. Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard was one of the most powerful religious figures of his time. A mystic, a reformer, and a master of persuasion. Where others saw armed monks as a contradiction, Bernard saw a solution. He believed violence could be sanctified if it served divine purpose. Under his guidance, the idea of the warrior monk was not just defended, it was celebrated. In 1129, at the Council of Troyes, the order received official recognition. They were granted a formal rule, heavily influenced by Cistercian monastic discipline. They were named the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. The Templars had arrived. With recognition came legitimacy. With legitimacy came donations. Lands, money, and privileges flowed in from across Europe. Kings and nobles, eager to secure spiritual favor or political alliances, endowed the order generously. Entire villages were signed over. Churches were built. Commanderies appeared along major routes, turning the Templars into a transcontinental network long before such a concept truly existed. Yet even as their wealth grew, their vows did not change. The Templars were forbidden from personal ownership. Everything belonged to the order. This created something entirely new in medieval society. A corporate entity with immense resources but no individual beneficiaries. Power without personal luxury. Wealth without visible indulgence. To some, this was inspiring. To others, deeply unsettling. Their appearance reinforced this paradox. The white mantle symbolized purity, the red cross sacrifice. They were not meant to be admired for splendor, but for discipline. They ate simply, spoke little, and trained constantly. Every detail of their lives was regulated, from how they mounted their horses to how they addressed one another. Unity was everything. On the battlefield, that unity became legend. Templars were trained to hold formation even in retreat, to fight without panic, to obey orders without hesitation. They were often placed at the front of armies, absorbing the initial shock of battle. Retreat without command was forbidden. Surrender was dishonor unless outnumbered beyond hope. These were not reckless rules. They were psychological weapons, forging a reputation that preceded them. Enemies learned to fear the sight of the Red Cross advancing without sound. But the battlefield was only one aspect of their influence. Behind the scenes, the Templars were quietly reshaping the medieval world. Their network of commanderies allowed pilgrims and nobles to deposit funds in one location and withdraw them in another. Letters of credit replaced the dangers of carrying coin across bandit-infested roads. In effect, the Templars created an early international banking system, backed not by crowns, but by trust. This trust was reinforced by papal privilege. The order answered directly to the Pope. They were exempt from local taxes and laws. Bishops could not command them. Kings could not judge them. In theory, this protected their mission. In practice, it placed them beyond the reach of nearly every earthly authority. At first, this independence was tolerated, even welcomed. The Templars served the Church, defended its territories, and financed its wars. They were instruments of Christendom's expansion. But independence has a way of becoming isolation. As decades passed, the original mission of guarding pilgrims became less central. The Crusader states weakened. Territories were lost. Battles ended in defeat. Yet the order remained, adapting rather than dissolving. They shifted focus to logistics, fortification, and finance. Their influence became quieter, more structural. And in quiet places, questions grow. Some wondered how an order sworn to poverty could command such wealth. Others questioned whether warriors trained for constant battle could truly remain spiritually pure. A few began to whisper that the Templars were no longer simply defenders of the faith, but custodians of something older, something rooted in the soil beneath Jerusalem itself. The rumors were faint at first, easily dismissed. But they clung to one detail that refused to fade. The Templars had spent years living atop the Temple Mount. Access to tunnels, foundations, and buried chambers was possible. Excavation was never documented, but medieval record-keeping was selective. Absence of evidence did not mean absence of activity. What if their rise was not only military or financial, but intellectual? The idea was unsettling. Christianity was built on revelation controlled by the Church. Scripture, doctrine, and interpretation flowed downward from sanctioned authority. If the Templars had encountered alternative traditions, lost texts, or interpretations that challenged orthodoxy, they would not simply be warriors anymore. They would be intermediaries of knowledge. And knowledge, unlike swords, cannot be surrendered without consequence. For now, these were only shadows at the edge of history. The order continued to expand, to fight, to fund. From the outside, they appeared as the ultimate expression of medieval devotion, disciplined, obedient, and unwavering. But the seeds of future destruction were already planted. The more powerful the Templars became, the more anomalous they appeared. They were monks who killed, bankers who claimed poverty, servants of the Church who could not be commanded by it. Every contradiction sharpened attention. Every privilege bred resentment. Their origins, once humble and inspiring, now seemed inconvenient. And as history would later prove, nothing unsettles institutions more than a group that no longer fits the story it was meant to tell. The place they were given was sacred long before the Templars ever set foot in Jerusalem. The Temple Mount was not just another stronghold or palace foundation. It was the spiritual heart of the city, layered with centuries of belief, destruction, and longing. Jews revered it as the site of Solomon's temple, the dwelling place of the divine presence. Christians inherited its symbolism as part of a sacred past woven into biblical memory. Muslims, too, held it holy. Few places on earth carried such weight. When King Baldwin II offered the newly formed order quarters there, it seemed like a gesture of honor and practicality. Space within the city walls was limited, and the former royal complex atop the mount was defensible and central. Yet for the men who accepted, the location carried meaning beyond convenience. They were not just guarding pilgrims anymore. They were living atop history itself. Their quarters were believed to rest over the ruins of Solomon's temple, destroyed centuries earlier and buried beneath layers of rebuilding. Little was known with certainty about what remained beneath the stone floors. Ancient texts hinted at hidden chambers, sealed passageways, and vaults used to safeguard sacred objects. Most of this was legend, blurred by time and war. But legend has a way of pointing toward something real. For nearly 9 years, the Templars lived there in relative seclusion. They prayed, trained, and maintained their vigil. Official records from this period are sparse. Medieval chroniclers had little interest in documenting the daily routines of a small, obscure group of knights. What survives are fragments, and in those gaps, possibility thrives. Later stories would claim that the Templars were not idle beneath the Temple Mount, that they explored what lay below, that they descended into forgotten spaces long sealed from human presence. Whether these claims are literal truth or symbolic exaggeration is impossible to know with certainty. But what matters is that such stories emerged at all, and that they endured. If the Templars did dig, they would not have been treasure hunters in the modern sense. Their interests, shaped by faith and symbolism, would have leaned toward relics, texts, or signs of divine history. The Temple of Solomon was said to have housed the Ark of the Covenant, sacred scrolls, priestly instruments, and objects tied directly to the covenant between God and humanity. To uncover even fragments connected to such a legacy would have been transformative. Imagine the psychological impact on men already devoted to a sacred mission. To walk beneath stone floors and touch remnants of ancient worship would blur the line between present faith and biblical past. History would no longer be something read or preached. It would be something felt, held, and interpreted. This is where the mystery deepens. The Templars did not publicly announce any discovery. No relic was paraded. No proclamation was made. Instead, their order slowly but dramatically changed. After this period beneath the Temple Mount, their expansion accelerated. Their confidence hardened. Their internal culture grew more insular, more disciplined, more secretive. Correlation does not prove causation, but it invites questions. Their seal depicted two knights sharing a single horse, a symbol often interpreted as humility or poverty. Yet some have suggested it may have held deeper meaning. Duality, shared burden, or hidden unity. Symbols, especially in medieval religious orders, were rarely accidental. Over time, the Templars became increasingly interested in architecture, geometry, and sacred proportion. Their churches, while outwardly simple, displayed a fascination with precise design and symbolic alignment. Circular churches, echoing the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, became common. Circles represented eternity, perfection, the divine without beginning or end. This was not unique to the Templars, but their consistency suggested a guiding philosophy. Some historians argue this was simply devotion expressed through form. Others see it as evidence of a deeper symbolic language, one that connected space, structure, and spiritual understanding. If the Templars had encountered alternative interpretations of sacred history beneath the Temple Mount, they would not have openly challenged church doctrine. That would have been unthinkable. Instead, such knowledge would have been internalized, encoded, protected by silence and ritual. Silence was already central to their rule. Templars were discouraged from idle conversation. Speech was regulated. Confession and obedience were emphasized. Secrets were not written down. They were passed orally within trusted circles. This method of transmission left no documents for future inquisitors to seize. What survived lived only in memory and practice. Centuries later, during the trials, accusers would claim the Templars worshipped a mysterious head or idol, sometimes described as bearded, sometimes as metallic, sometimes as having two faces. These descriptions were wildly inconsistent, likely shaped by fear and leading questions. But the persistence of the claim suggests symbolic misunderstanding rather than fabrication from nothing. If the Templars did possess an object or symbol discovered beneath the Temple Mount, its meaning could easily have been distorted when removed from context. What was once reverence could be recast as idolatry. What was once symbolic could be labeled demonic. There is also the possibility that nothing physical was found at all, that the true discovery was intellectual. Ancient ideas, suppressed texts, or alternative theological traditions might have survived in fragments beneath Jerusalem. Early Christianity was not monolithic. Competing interpretations existed for centuries before orthodoxy was enforced. Gnostic traditions, emphasizing direct spiritual knowledge over institutional authority, had been labeled heretical and erased. To encounter even echoes of such traditions in a place as charged as the Temple Mount would have been dangerous. Not because they were false, but because they challenged the structure of control. The Church's power rested on mediation. God spoke through sanctioned channels. Salvation flowed through sacraments administered by approved clergy. Any belief that suggested divine connection could exist outside this system threatened the entire hierarchy. If the Templars absorbed such ideas, they would have done so cautiously. Not as rebels, but as guardians. Knowledge would be treated like a relic, powerful, sacred, and not meant for the unprepared. This could explain their later behavior. Their refusal to submit fully to secular authority. Their insistence on answering only to the Pope, and even then, maintaining internal autonomy. Their resilience under accusation. Men protecting wealth crumble when threatened. Men protecting belief do not. It also explains the Church's eventual response. When the trials began, The focus was not on what the Templars did on battlefields or in banks. It was on what they believed, on what they said during initiation, on what they renounced or revered in secret. Those questions did not come from nowhere. The Temple Mount period remained a wound in the historical record, a time when the order existed beyond scrutiny, beyond documentation. Later chroniclers looked back and filled the silence with speculation. Modern historians try to separate myth from fact, but the truth may lie somewhere between. What is undeniable is that the Templars emerged from beneath Solomon's temple as something more than they had been before. Still obedient, still devout, but changed. And change, when it originates in hidden places, has a way of unsettling the world long after its source is forgotten. The stones beneath Jerusalem have seen empires rise and fall. They have buried secrets before. If the Templars learned something there, whether object, idea, or insight, it would not have remained buried forever. It would surface slowly, quietly, in symbols, rituals, and resolve. And eventually, it would draw the attention of those who feared what they could not control. The first thing a new brother learned was not how to fight or how to pray, or even how to wear the white mantle. It was how to remain silent. Silence was not merely a rule within the order. It was a discipline, a shield, and a test. Words, once spoken, could not be reclaimed. Knowledge, once shared too freely, could lose its power or become dangerous. For the Templars, discretion was survival. When a man sought entry into the order, he was not welcomed immediately. He was observed. His past was examined. His motives questioned. Was he fleeing debt, disgrace, or punishment? Was he seeking glory, or genuinely surrendering himself to a life of obedience? Only those deemed worthy were allowed to proceed, and even then, the path forward was deliberately unsettling. The initiation ceremony did not take place in public chapels filled with light and incense. It occurred in private, often at night behind closed doors. What happened there was known only to those present. No official record survives describing the ritual in full. What we know comes from fragments. Later accusations, partial confessions, and second-hand testimony, all shaped by pressure and fear. Yet when these fragments are examined together, a pattern begins to emerge. The candidate was brought before senior members of the order, sometimes blindfolded, symbolically stripped of his former identity. He was reminded that what he was about to hear and see could not be shared, even under threat of death. Obedience was absolute. Loyalty was not to individual men, but to the order itself. At some point, vows were taken. Poverty, chastity, obedience. These were standard monastic commitments, but within the Templar context they carried additional weight. Poverty meant not just owning nothing, but desiring nothing. Obedience meant surrendering personal judgment. Faith became something lived, not debated. It was here, according to later claims, that the ritual took an unsettling turn. Accusers would later allege that initiates were instructed to deny Christ, to spit on or trample the cross, to participate in gestures meant to shock and test them. On the surface, these accusations appear absurd, even grotesque. Why would a Christian order require blasphemy as an entry requirement? The Church seized upon these claims as proof of heresy. But history demands a deeper question. Why did these accusations take this specific form? Forced confessions under torture are unreliable, but they are not random. Interrogators often lead, shaping responses through expectation. Yet, the repetition of certain themes suggests something was being misunderstood rather than invented wholesale. Symbolic acts, taken literally by outsiders, can appear monstrous when removed from context. In medieval religious practice, symbolic inversion was not unheard of. Trials of humility, where sacred symbols were approached in ways meant to strip away surface reverence, existed in various mystical traditions. The goal was not denial of faith, but confrontation with it, to separate genuine belief from habit or fear. If the Templars employed such a test, it would have been dangerous to explain openly. Only those prepared for deeper instruction would understand the meaning behind the act. To everyone else, it would look like sacrilege. The spitting on the cross, if it occurred at all, may not have been a rejection of Christ, but a renunciation of false piety. An acknowledgement that wood and metal were not the divine itself. That faith did not reside in objects, but in understanding. This idea alone would have been enough to provoke outrage in an institution built on relics and visible symbols. More disturbing to church authorities was the claim that the Templars possessed a secret interpretation of Christ's nature. Some confessions suggested they believed Jesus was not fully divine, or that his suffering was symbolic rather than salvific. These ideas echoed ancient debates suppressed centuries earlier. Gnostic traditions had questioned whether salvation came through obedience or through knowledge. The Church had answered decisively, through the Church itself. To resurrect such questions, even indirectly, was forbidden. Yet if the Templars had encountered alternative teachings during their years in the East, through contact with Eastern Christians, Islamic scholars, or ancient texts, they may have absorbed perspectives unfamiliar to Western orthodoxy. The Crusader states were cultural crossroads. Ideas moved alongside armies. Initiation, then, would not merely induct a man into an order. It would reframe how he understood faith. This reframing required absolute secrecy, not because it was evil, but because it was destabilizing. A knight who believed salvation was tied to personal understanding rather than institutional mediation would still fight for Christendom, but his loyalty would be internal, not hierarchical. That distinction mattered. Within the order, such ideas could be managed, shared only among the initiated, reinforced through discipline and ritual. Outside the order, they would be seen as rebellion. The accusations also mentioned the worship of a mysterious head, sometimes called Baphomet. The descriptions varied wildly, suggesting confusion rather than clarity. Some said it was a skull, others a carved head with two faces. Others still described it as metallic or bearded. No physical object matching these descriptions was ever conclusively produced. If such a symbol existed, it may have represented wisdom, memory, or divine presence rather than an idol. In many traditions, the head symbolizes consciousness and authority. To revere it symbolically would not necessarily mean worshipping it as a god. But medieval inquisitors were not trained to interpret symbolism. Their task was to categorize, not to understand. Anything that did not fit accepted doctrine was labeled heresy by default. The secrecy surrounding initiation also created fertile ground for suspicion. The Templars did not explain their rituals. They did not defend them publicly. Silence, once a shield, became a liability. In an atmosphere of fear, what is hidden is assumed to be sinister. Yet silence can also be a form of integrity. During the trials, some Templars confessed quickly under torture. Others later retracted their statements, insisting they had lied to escape pain. A few refused to confess at all, enduring suffering without yielding. These men spoke of their vows not as empty promises, but as binding truths. To betray the order's secrets, even to save their lives, was unthinkable. This level of commitment suggests the secrets mattered deeply. If the initiation rites were merely administrative or symbolic in a shallow sense, death would not have been preferable to disclosure. But if those rites contained ideas that redefined the nature of faith, authority, or salvation, then silence would become an act of preservation. The Church interpreted this silence as stubbornness or guilt. It never seriously considered that the Templars might believe they were protecting something sacred from misuse. In medieval Europe, obedience was the highest virtue. Questioning authority was equated with questioning God. The Templars, by maintaining a private inner doctrine, however subtle or symbolic, disrupted this equation. Their initiation was not just an entry ritual. It was a boundary. On one side stood the visible church with its sacraments and hierarchy. On the other stood a deeper, quieter understanding of faith, accessible only to those willing to submit not just their bodies, but their assumptions. Whether this understanding was truly heretical or simply misunderstood may never be fully known. What is clear is that once these accusations surfaced, the distinction no longer mattered. Perception became reality. The first secret oath, whatever its exact content, created an inner world that could not be controlled from outside. And in a system built on control, that alone was unforgivable. From that moment on, the fate of the Templars was sealed. not by what they had done, but by what they might have believed. Power did not arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, almost unnoticed, carried on the backs of gratitude and trust. The Templars did not conquer kingdoms or overthrow rulers. They were invited in. Their rise was not driven by ambition, but by usefulness. And that made it all the more dangerous. As the Crusader states struggled to survive, Europe looked for stability in a chaotic world. Roads were unsafe. Borders shifted constantly. Coins lost value as rulers debased currency to fund wars. In this uncertainty, the Templars offered something rare: reliability. A man could place his wealth in their care and trust it would still exist when he needed it again. A pilgrim could travel under their protection and expect to arrive alive. A king could borrow from them and know the terms would be honored without deception. This reputation spread faster than any proclamation. Across France, England, Iberia, and the German lands, noble families began granting the order estates and income. Some donations were acts of genuine devotion, offered in exchange for prayers and spiritual favor. Others were practical arrangements, turning land into secure assets managed by disciplined administrators. Over time, the Templars became one of the largest landholders in Europe, not through conquest but through confidence. Yet for all this wealth, the individual Templar remained unchanged. A knight still slept in shared quarters. He still ate simply, often in silence. His clothing remained plain. His life was governed by rules that left little room for indulgence. The contrast between the order's resources and the lifestyle of its members was striking. Wealth flowed through the institution, not into it. This distinction mattered deeply. It allowed the Templars to claim moral authority even as their influence expanded. They were not seen as corrupt lords hoarding gold, but as stewards of resources directed toward a sacred mission. Their involvement in finance, however, marked a turning point. What began as safeguarding pilgrim funds evolved into a complex system of credit and transfer. A traveler could deposit money at a Templar commandery in Paris and withdraw an equivalent sum in Acre. Written instruments replaced heavy coin. Transactions were recorded, secured, and honored across borders. In an age suspicious of moneylending, the Templars occupied a unique position. As a religious order, they were exempt from accusations of usury. As warriors, they were respected. As administrators, they were efficient. This combination made them indispensable. Kings relied on Templar loans to fund wars, marriages, and diplomacy. The order financed military campaigns and managed treasuries. In some cases, Templars even transported royal taxes. Their fortresses doubled as vaults. Their seals carried authority. But dependence breeds resentment. As monarchs grew accustomed to borrowing, they also grew uncomfortable with owing. A king in debt is a king constrained. Every unpaid loan was a reminder that power had limits. And the Templars, bound by vows rather than crowns, could not be coerced in the usual ways. Unlike nobles, they could not be threatened with loss of title. Unlike merchants, they could not be expelled without consequences. They answered to a structure that transcended borders. Their military presence added another layer to this unease. Templar castles dotted strategic routes in the Holy Land and Europe alike. Built with precision and foresight, these fortresses were not just defensive positions, but statements of permanence. Thick walls, commanding views, and self-sufficiency made them formidable. To allies, they were reassuring. To rivals, intimidating. On the battlefield, their discipline continued to earn respect. Templars were often deployed as shock troops, breaking enemy lines through cohesion rather than numbers. They fought with a calm that bordered on detachment, guided by rules that valued collective survival over individual heroics. But even as their martial reputation grew, the nature of warfare changed. The Crusades faltered. Territory was lost. The dream of a permanent Christian East faded. The Templars adapted, but adaptation can look like stubbornness to those seeking closure. Back in Europe, their continued prominence began to feel unnecessary. Why maintain a powerful military order when its original purpose was slipping away? Why allow an institution to retain privileges granted for a mission that no longer existed in the same form? These questions were not asked openly at first. They circulated quietly among courts and councils, whispered doubts rather than accusations. The Templars did not help their case by remaining aloof. Their internal cohesion, once a strength, became a barrier. They did not court public favor. They did not explain themselves. They operated with an efficiency that left little room for reassurance. Their independence from local authorities became a focal point of tension. Papal bulls had granted them sweeping exemptions: freedom from taxes, the right to build their own chapels, the authority to collect tithes. Bishops resented this intrusion into their jurisdiction. Parish priests saw donations diverted. Religious rivals envied their influence. Power, when shared unequally, invites scrutiny. By the late 13th century, the Templars stood at the intersection of faith, finance, and force. They were monks who wielded swords, bankers who claimed poverty, servants of the church who operated beyond its daily control. Each role alone was manageable. Combined, they were unprecedented. This uniqueness made them indispensable and isolated. As Europe changed, centralized monarchies began to assert themselves more aggressively. Kings sought control over taxation, justice, and military force. Independent institutions became obstacles to consolidation. The Templars, with their transnational network and papal allegiance, embodied everything these new monarchies found inconvenient. King Philip IV of France was not the first to feel this tension, but he felt it most acutely. His reign was marked by financial strain and a relentless drive for authority. He clashed with the papacy, devalued currency, and taxed clergy. The Templars, wealthy and untouchable, stood apart from these struggles. They were not plotting against him. They did not need to. Their mere existence was a reminder that his power was not absolute. At the same time, popular perception of the Templars began to shift. Legends exaggerated their wealth. Stories circulated of hidden treasure and secret dealings. Admiration mixed with suspicion. In a deeply religious society, any group that grew too powerful without clear explanation risked being seen as morally compromised. The irony was profound. The very discipline that had enabled their rise now fueled mistrust. Their silence became arrogance. Their unity became secrecy. Their wealth, though institutional, became personal in the public imagination. And beneath all of this, a deeper anxiety simmered. The Templars were not just powerful. They were coherent. Their loyalty was internal, reinforced by vows and shared identity. They could not be easily divided or co-opted. In a world where power was maintained through personal alliances and rivalries, this cohesion was alien. Institutions fear what they cannot fragment. By the time their fall began, the groundwork had already been laid. Envy, fear, debt, and misunderstanding had converged. The Templars did not notice the shift until it was too late. Accustomed to operating above suspicion, they underestimated how quickly admiration could turn into hostility. Their transformation from poor knights to kingmakers had been gradual, almost accidental. But history does not judge intention. It responds to imbalance. And the imbalance had grown too great to ignore. Inside the order, life followed a rhythm that outsiders rarely understood. The world saw the Templars as warriors and bankers, but within their walls, discipline mattered more than power. Every action, every word, every silence was regulated. This was not merely about obedience. It was about shaping the mind. A man who could control his impulses could be trusted with responsibility. A man who could remain silent under strain could be trusted with secrets. The Templar rule governed daily existence with relentless detail. Brothers rose before dawn for prayer. Meals were taken together, often in silence, while scripture was read aloud. Even gestures were prescribed. Laughter was discouraged. Vanity was forbidden. Horses were inspected as carefully as weapons. Nothing belonged to the individual, not even his time. Such rigidity created uniformity, but it also created something deeper: predictability. In a dangerous world, predictability is a form of safety. A knight who knew exactly how his brothers would act in battle or crisis could rely on them completely. This internal reliability allowed the order to operate with remarkable efficiency. Messages moved quickly. Commands were obeyed without debate. Disputes were handled privately, away from public scrutiny. To outsiders, this looked like secrecy. To insiders, it was cohesion. Within this structure existed layers of knowledge. Not every brother knew everything. Recruits learned the basics: prayer, discipline, combat readiness. As trust grew, responsibilities expanded. Commanders were entrusted with administration, logistics, and strategy. At the highest levels, the Grand Master and his council coordinated efforts across continents. This hierarchy was practical, but it also served another purpose. Sensitive information could be contained. Ideas could be shared selectively. The order did not need written doctrine beyond its rule. It relied on oral transmission and example. Oral tradition leaves no paper trail. Symbols played an important role in this internal culture. The Red Cross, worn openly, signified sacrifice and commitment. But other symbols appeared quietly, carved into stone, woven into seals, embedded in architecture. These were not explained publicly. They did not need to be. Medieval people lived in a symbolic world. Images carried meaning far beyond decoration. Geometry, proportion, and orientation were languages in themselves. A trained observer could read intent in the shape of a building or the alignment of a chapel. The Templars understood this deeply. Their churches often followed circular designs, echoing the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Circles represented eternity and unity, but they also erased hierarchy. There was no clear front or back, no elevated throne. Everyone stood equidistant from the center. This architectural choice subtly reinforced the idea that proximity to the divine was not mediated by rank. Such symbolism was quiet, but not accidental. Within the order, obedience was paramount, but it was obedience to the rule, not to individual personalities. This distinction mattered. Authority flowed from structure, not charisma. A commander could be removed if he violated the rule. Even the Grand Master was bound by it. This created a culture resistant to corruption. It also made the order resilient. Remove one leader and the system continued. There was no single figure whose fall would collapse the whole. From the perspective of emerging monarchies, this was troubling. Power that cannot be personalized cannot be controlled through favors or threats. The Templars' internal communication reinforced this resilience. Messages were concise, coded in plain language that revealed little if intercepted. Sensitive matters were discussed face-to-face. Decisions were documented minimally. The order left few fingerprints. This was not paranoia. It was necessity. Operating across hostile territories required caution. Yet these habits, developed for survival, later fed suspicion. What did they have to hide? The answer from within would have been simple: everything that mattered. Trust inside the order was earned through endurance. A brother proved himself not by brilliance, but by consistency. He followed the rule when tired, when afraid, when unobserved. Only then was he considered reliable. Such men, bound by shared hardship, developed loyalty that went beyond convenience. They were not brothers by blood, but by discipline. Betrayal was not just a breach of trust. It was a collapse of identity. This loyalty explains much about their behavior during the trials. Men who had been trained to endure silence and pain without reaction were less likely to panic. Some broke, but others held fast in ways that baffled their interrogators. Torture is designed to isolate the victim. It strips away context, reduces life to pain and relief. But the Templars' training had already prepared them for isolation. They had learned to separate internal belief from external circumstance. This psychological resilience was mistaken for stubbornness or guilt. It was, in fact, discipline. Within this disciplined world, ideas could circulate slowly and safely. The order did not encourage speculation or debate, but reflection was unavoidable. A man who prays daily, fights regularly, and witnesses death repeatedly cannot avoid questions about meaning. The Templars encountered diverse cultures and beliefs across the Mediterranean. They interacted with Eastern Christians, Muslims, and Jews. They saw how faith was expressed differently, yet often with equal sincerity. This exposure did not necessarily weaken their devotion, but it complicated it. Exposure leads to comparison. Comparison leads to reflection. Such reflection was dangerous if expressed openly. But within the order's protected environment, it could be absorbed without fracturing unity. Belief could deepen rather than dissolve. This internal world, shaped by discipline and silence, allowed the Templars to hold complexity without broadcasting it. They could serve the Church faithfully while privately understanding faith in broader terms. To an institution that demanded uniformity of thought, this was unacceptable. The Church's authority depended on clarity. Doctrine had to be fixed, interpretable by trained clergy, enforceable through hierarchy. Any group that internalized belief rather than externalizing it threatened this clarity. The Templars did not preach alternative doctrines. They did not write treatises. They did not recruit followers outside their order. Their threat was subtle. They embodied a model of faith that did not require constant oversight. Such a model could not spread easily, but it could inspire. And inspiration is harder to control than dissent. As tensions grew, the Church and secular rulers interpreted Templar discipline through their own anxieties. Silence became secrecy. Unity became conspiracy. Structure became defiance. The Templars had built an internal code that made them strong, reliable, and independent. It had served them well for nearly 2 centuries. But it also made them opaque to those who demanded transparency on their own terms. When accusations finally came, there was little room for defense. The order could not suddenly explain what it had spent generations keeping internal. To do so would have betrayed its own foundation. So the code held. Even as pressure mounted, even as torture intensified, many Templars remained silent. Not because they had nothing to say, but because they believed some things were not meant to be said at all. And in that silence, their enemies found the justification they needed. At first, the accusations surfaced quietly, almost hesitantly, like a rumor no one wanted to repeat aloud. They did not begin in royal courts or papal councils, but in murmurs, half-formed doubts exchanged in cloisters, taverns, and council chambers. The Templars had grown too powerful, too distant, too unknowable. In a world where transparency was equated with virtue, their silence invited imagination. And imagination, when fueled by fear, rarely remains kind. The earliest whispers did not accuse the Templars of greed or political ambition. Those would have been understandable sins. Instead, the rumors targeted something far more dangerous: belief. It was said that behind closed doors, the knights practiced strange rites. That their devotion was not what it appeared to be. That beneath the white mantle and red cross lay a faith twisted, inverted, or corrupted. Such claims were explosive precisely because they attacked the foundation of the order's legitimacy. The Templars existed by papal authority. Their privileges, wealth, and independence rested on the assumption that they were orthodox defenders of the faith. To question their belief was to question their right to exist at all. The rumors grew sharper with repetition. It was said that during initiation, new members were forced to deny Christ, that they were ordered to spit upon the cross, to trample it underfoot, that they were taught secret doctrines contradicting the Church's teachings. Each retelling added detail, but clarity never improved. The stories shifted depending on who told them, shaped by local anxieties and expectations. What united these accusations was not evidence, but tone. They carried the emotional charge of betrayal. These were not outsiders attacking Christianity. These were supposed guardians of the faith, accused of secretly undermining it from within. That idea alone was enough to provoke outrage. In medieval Europe, heresy was not merely a theological error. It was a social threat. Belief structured daily life, law, morality, and hierarchy. To deviate was to destabilize the entire system. Heretics were not debated. They were eliminated. The Church had long experience dealing with dissent. Cathars, Waldensians, and other groups had already been crushed for questioning doctrine or authority. What made the Templars different was their status. They were not poor preachers or isolated communities. They were powerful, armed, and respected. Accusing them of heresy required caution, until it didn't. As the whispers spread, they began to attract attention from those who had reasons to listen. Bishops resented the order's exemptions. Clergy envied their donations. Monarchs bristled at their independence. Each rumor, however unproven, fit neatly into existing frustrations. And then there was the strangest accusation of all. Some claimed the Templars worshipped an idol, a mysterious figure known as Baphomet. The descriptions were wildly inconsistent. A severed head, a bearded face, a metal object, a skull. Sometimes it spoke. Sometimes it granted wealth. Sometimes it was simply present. From a modern perspective, these contradictions undermine the claim. From a medieval one, they did not. Medieval accusations often relied on symbolic language rather than empirical consistency. The very ambiguity of Baphomet made it more frightening. Could be anything, and therefore everything. To church authorities trained to identify paganism and demonic influence, such claims were deeply troubling. Idol worship was a clear violation of the first commandment. If true, it would place the Templars beyond redemption. Yet no physical idol was ever conclusively produced. What existed were words, spoken under pressure, shaped by expectation. Torture, when later applied, did not uncover truth so much as confirm suspicion. Men were asked leading questions, and pain taught them which answers were acceptable. Still, the persistence of the accusations suggests they were not invented entirely from nothing. It is possible that the Templars used symbolic objects in private devotion, relics, representations, or teaching tools misunderstood by outsiders. Medieval spirituality was deeply visual. Symbols were not mere decoration. They were conduits of meaning. A skull could represent mortality. A head could symbolize wisdom or sacrifice. Without context, symbolism collapses into superstition. The Church, however, was not inclined to grant context. More troubling than idols were claims about doctrine. Some confessions suggested the Templars believed Christ was not divine in the way the Church taught, that his suffering was symbolic, that salvation came not through sacraments, but through knowledge or understanding. These ideas echoed ancient debates the Church believed it had settled centuries earlier. Such beliefs, if held privately, might have remained harmless. But belief shapes behavior. A knight who viewed salvation as internal rather than institutional might obey the Church outwardly while reserving ultimate authority for conscience. That possibility was intolerable. As these accusations circulated, the Church found itself in an uncomfortable position. The Templars were too powerful to attack without cause, but the rumors were too dangerous to ignore. Investigations were proposed, then delayed. Questions were raised, then softened. No one wanted to be the first to strike. That hesitation would later be remembered as complicity. Outside official channels, public opinion began to shift. Stories exaggerated. Fear sharpened edges. The Templars, once admired, became objects of suspicion. Their silence, once seen as discipline, now felt evasive. Their unity, once inspiring, seemed conspiratorial. The order did little to counter this narrative. It had never concerned itself with public relations. To explain its internal practices would have violated its own principles. To deny accusations would have required acknowledging them. Silence, again, felt safer. But silence leaves room for others to speak. By the time royal officials began collecting testimonies, the story had taken on a life of its own. Each confession, coerced or not, reinforced the narrative. Each denial was dismissed as stubbornness. The possibility that the accusations were distorted reflections of misunderstood practices was never seriously entertained. The Church framed the issue as a matter of purity. It could not allow even the appearance of heresy to fester within its most visible order. Better to act decisively than to risk uncertainty. Yet beneath the official concern for doctrine lay something more human: fear of losing control. The Templars represented an alternative model of faith, disciplined, internalized, and resistant to oversight. Even if their beliefs were orthodox, their independence made them suspect. Institutions rarely wait for proof when authority feels threatened. As the accusations hardened into charges, the language shifted. What had once been rumors became certainties. What had been whispered was now proclaimed. The Templars were no longer questioned. They were defined. And once defined as heretics, their fate was sealed. The tragedy is that truth became irrelevant. Whether the Templars held secret doctrines, misunderstood symbols, or simply valued silence too much no longer mattered. Perception had replaced reality. The Church and Crown no longer asked what the Templars believed, but what could be done about them. In that moment, centuries of service were erased by suspicion. Faith was measured not by devotion, but by conformity. And the whispers that had begun as unease became the justification for destruction. The accusations did not need to be true. They only needed to be believed. In Rome, concern did not arrive as panic. It arrived as paperwork. Letters, reports, and murmured complaints began to accumulate on desks in the Curia, each one small and reasonable on its own, but together forming a troubling pattern. Bishops complained that Templar chapels drew donations away from parish churches. Abbots questioned why an armed order answered to no local authority. Envoys from kings hinted carefully that the order's privileges were becoming politically inconvenient. None of this sounded like heresy. It sounded like competition. For centuries, the Church had learned to tolerate powerful orders so long as they remained useful and obedient. The Templars had once fit that role perfectly. They defended holy lands, protected pilgrims, and embodied a militant devotion that inspired the faithful. But as the Crusader dream collapsed, their usefulness became harder to define. What remained was power without a clear purpose. Power, when detached from justification, invites scrutiny. The papacy itself was not monolithic. Some popes admired the Templars and defended them fiercely. Others were uneasy, sensing an imbalance they could not easily correct. The order answered directly to Rome, yet operated beyond daily papal oversight. This paradox created a quiet anxiety. Authority existed in theory but not always in practice. And beneath this administrative unease lay a deeper, unspoken fear: knowledge. The Church's authority rested not only on spiritual legitimacy, but on control of interpretation. Scripture, doctrine, and ritual flowed through sanctioned channels. When belief was mediated, it could be regulated. When it became internalized, shaped by personal understanding or secret tradition, it slipped beyond reach. The Templars, through their discipline and silence, embodied a form of faith that did not require constant supervision. They prayed, obeyed, and fought without needing external reinforcement. This self-contained devotion was admirable until it wasn't. Rome began to wonder what else the Templars might be holding internally. The rumors of secret rites and alternative beliefs reached the papacy slowly, filtered through layers of caution. No pope wanted to accuse his own champions without cause. But each rumor, however faint, suggested a loss of transparency. And in institutions built on hierarchy, opacity is unsettling. Historically, the Church had faced this problem before. Gnostic movements, mystical sects, and reformist orders had all claimed access to deeper truths. Each time, the response was the same: centralize, codify, suppress. Diversity of belief was framed as division. Unity required uniformity. The Templars, intentionally or not, stood outside this pattern. They did not preach. They did not write new theology. They did not recruit followers from the laity. Their inner world was sealed. That made it difficult to confront, but impossible to ignore. If something was hidden, Rome wanted to know what it was. At the same time, secular pressure intensified. Kings sought greater control over their realms and resented institutions they could not command. The papacy found itself caught between defending an order it had once empowered and accommodating rulers whose support it needed. Political survival demanded compromise. Fear entered the conversation not as terror, but as calculation. What would happen if the Templars continued to grow unchecked? What if their financial networks rivaled those of kings? What if their loyalty to Rome wavered, or worse, what if their beliefs diverged from orthodoxy in ways that could not be corrected? The Church did not yet have answers, but it had questions. And questions, when unanswered, tend to multiply. The idea that the Templars possessed forbidden knowledge was particularly troubling. Knowledge is cumulative. It does not remain static. If the order had encountered alternative interpretations of scripture or ancient traditions in the East, those ideas could evolve internally. Over generations, subtle differences could become profound ones. Even the possibility of this was unacceptable. Church authority depended on clarity. This is what we believe, this is how we practice, this is who decides. Any group that blurred those lines threatened the entire structure. The Templars' independence was no longer a privilege. It was a liability. Some within the Church argued for reform. Bring the Templars closer. Increase oversight. Integrate them more fully into ecclesiastical hierarchy. But reform requires cooperation, and the order had little incentive to change. Their system worked. They were loyal, disciplined, and effective. From their perspective, Rome's concerns likely felt abstract, even misplaced. This disconnect widened the gap. As years passed, the Church's fear was compounded by uncertainty. Investigations produced no clear evidence of heresy, but also no reassurance. The absence of proof did not restore confidence. It undermined it further. If nothing could be found, perhaps it was because the Templars were too careful. Suspicion, once rooted, is difficult to dislodge. The papacy also faced its own vulnerabilities. Political conflicts with monarchs weakened its position. Financial strain limited its independence. In this context, defending a powerful, controversial order became risky. The Templars were no longer an asset in negotiations. They were a complication. When King Philip IV of France began to voice concerns more forcefully, Rome listened. Not because it trusted him completely, but because it could not afford to alienate him. The Church's fear was no longer just theological. It was existential. What if protecting the Templars meant provoking a schism? What if refusing to act made the papacy appear weak? Authority depends as much on perception as on principle. Gradually, the tone shifted. The question was no longer whether the Templars were guilty, but whether they were worth defending. In moments like these, institutions often choose stability over loyalty. The Church told itself it was acting prudently, that it was preventing scandal, that it was safeguarding the faith. Each justification made the next step easier. Fear does not announce itself as fear, presents itself as responsibility. By the time decisive action was taken, the groundwork had already been laid. The Church's fear had evolved from concern to acceptance. Acceptance that the Templars, whatever their intentions, had become too powerful, too secretive, too independent to exist unchanged. And once that conclusion was reached, the outcome was inevitable. The tragedy is not that the Church feared the Templars. It is that fear replaced understanding. Dialogue gave way to calculation, and an order once created to serve the faith was reclassified as a threat to it. In the quiet halls of Rome, long before chains were fastened or fires lit, the decision had already been made, not in a single moment, but through a gradual surrender to anxiety. The Church did not destroy the Templars because it knew their secret. It destroyed them because it could not control what it did not fully understand. Philip IV of France was not a man prone to hesitation. Tall, imposing, and severe in temperament, he ruled with a sense of destiny sharpened by insecurity. History would remember him as the fair, but there was little softness in his reign. He inherited a kingdom strained by war, debt, and ambition, and from the moment he took the crown, he sought to impose order through control. Every institution within France was expected to bend toward the monarchy or be broken. By the early 14th century, Philip's greatest weakness was financial. Wars against England and Flanders had drained the royal treasury. Lavish court expenses and administrative reforms demanded constant funding. Coinage was debased repeatedly, eroding public trust and fueling unrest. Taxes were raised, then raised again. Even the Church was not spared, leading to open conflict with the papacy. Philip was a king desperate for stability, yet surrounded by forces he could not easily command. Among those forces stood the Templars. They were everywhere in France, their commanderies woven into the fabric of the kingdom. They managed land, moved money, and guarded treasure. The French crown itself relied on them as bankers. Royal funds were deposited in the Paris Temple, one of the most secure fortresses in the realm. In theory, this relationship was mutually beneficial. In reality, it was humiliating. A king who owes is a king who is exposed. Philip understood power as something that must be visible and unquestioned. The Templars challenged this instinct not by defying him, but by existing beyond him. They did not bow. They did not flatter. They operated according to their rule, not his will. Their loyalty was not personal. It was institutional. This made them immune to the traditional tools of royal influence. Philip had already demonstrated his willingness to confront powerful institutions. He had clashed openly with Pope Boniface VIII, even orchestrating his arrest. He had expelled Jews from France, seizing their assets to relieve debt. These actions revealed a pattern. When faced with financial crisis, Philip framed necessity as righteousness and moved decisively. The Templars, however, were more complicated. They were not outsiders. They were not a marginalized group. They were revered warriors of Christendom, sanctioned by the Church and respected by the people. To attack them openly would require justification on a scale that exceeded financial grievance. Philip needed more than motive. He needed moral authority. The rumors circulating about the Templars provided an opportunity. Accusations of heresy, once dismissed as gossip, began to look useful. Heresy was not just a religious crime, it was a political weapon. A heretic could be stripped of rights, property, and protection. A heretical order could be dissolved without apology. Philip's genius lay not in inventing accusations, but in recognizing their potential. He began gathering information quietly. Informants were cultivated. Disgruntled former Templars were questioned. Stories were collected not to be verified, but to be shaped. The goal was not truth. It was plausibility. The accusations needed to be shocking enough to justify action, but familiar enough to be believed. Philip understood public psychology. The Templars' secrecy, once admired, could be reframed as concealment. Their discipline could be recast as coercion. Their symbols could be interpreted as signs of hidden allegiance. Nothing needed to be proven immediately. Doubt alone was sufficient to act. Timing was critical. Philip waited until he had secured papal cooperation, or at least acquiescence. Pope Clement V was cautious, politically vulnerable, and deeply aware of Philip's power. The papacy's recent humiliation had left scars. Clement did not trust Philip, but he feared him. That fear would prove decisive. When the king finally moved, he did so with breathtaking coordination. On October 13, 1307, royal officers across France acted simultaneously. Arrest warrants, prepared in secret, were opened at dawn. Templars were seized without warning. No opportunity was given to resist, flee, or prepare a defense. The scale of the operation suggested months of planning. Philip framed the arrests as an act of moral duty. He claimed to be protecting the faith from corruption. In public statements, he expressed sorrow, not triumph. The performance was deliberate. A righteous king does not appear eager when punishing heresy. He appears burdened by necessity. Behind the scenes, the calculations were colder. The Templars' assets were frozen, their properties seized. Their treasury fell under royal control. Debts vanished. Financial pressure eased. The kingdom breathed again. What centuries of service had built was undone in a single morning. Yet Philip's actions were not purely pragmatic. There was an emotional dimension to his campaign. The Templars represented a challenge to his authority that he could not tolerate. They answered to a higher power. They operated beyond his reach. Their wealth and independence mocked his struggles. Destroying them was not just profitable. It was symbolic. Philip understood the power of narrative. By framing the Templars as heretics, he transformed himself from debtor to savior. He was no longer a king acting out of desperation, but a ruler defending Christendom from internal rot. The irony was profound. A deeply secular monarch cloaked his ambitions in religious language, while a religious order was condemned for secret beliefs it could not publicly explain. As interrogations began, Philip pushed relentlessly for confessions. Torture was authorized. Pressure was applied. Results were expected. The goal was not investigation, but confirmation. Each confession validated the arrests. Each denial was interpreted as defiance. Philip's resolve did not waver when inconsistencies emerged. Confessions contradicted one another. Details shifted, but consistency was not required. In the logic of power, repetition creates truth. When some Templars later recanted, claiming their confessions had been forced, Philip ignored them. Recantation threatened the narrative. The story had already been told. He also understood the importance of speed. Delay invites doubt. The faster the proceedings moved, the less time there was for resistance or reconsideration. Public opinion hardened quickly. Shock turned into acceptance. Acceptance into indifference. For Philip, the campaign against the Templars was a masterclass in political consolidation. He neutralized a powerful institution, seized its wealth, and asserted dominance over both church and nobility. Few kings had ever achieved so much in so little time. But power gained through destruction leaves consequences. Philip could not fully control the aftermath. The international nature of the order meant his actions resonated beyond France. Other rulers hesitated. Some resisted. England and the Holy Roman Empire conducted their own investigations, often with far less enthusiasm. The narrative fractured along borders. Philip responded with pressure. Diplomacy hardened. Rome was reminded of its vulnerability. Eventually, the papacy capitulated, dissolving the order under duress. From Philip's perspective, the outcome justified the means. Yet history rarely judges so simply. Philip died not long after the final executions. His dynasty faltered. The wealth he seized did not bring lasting stability. The image of a king who destroyed an order sworn to Christ would haunt his legacy. Still, for a moment in time, desperation and ambition aligned perfectly. And in that alignment, the Templars were crushed. Philip did not destroy them because he fully believed they were heretics. He destroyed them because they stood in the way of absolute power, and because desperation, when armed with authority, does not ask permission from truth. The operation did not unfold in chaos. It unfolded in silence. Long before the arrests, before the chains and accusations, the groundwork had been laid with meticulous care. Orders were written, sealed, and hidden. Names were compiled. Locations mapped. Trusted officials were selected not for mercy, but for obedience. The plan was simple in design and devastating in execution. Strike everywhere at once, leave no space for warning, no moment for defense. Secrecy was essential. The Templars were trained soldiers. Given even a hint of danger, they could have fortified their commanderies, secured their records, or fled across borders where royal authority weakened. Philip understood this. Surprise would be his greatest weapon. In the weeks leading up to the arrests, royal messengers carried sealed letters throughout France. These letters were not to be opened until a specific date. Officials were instructed under threat of severe punishment to keep them closed. Many did not know what they were about to do until the moment they did it. At dawn on Friday, October 13, 1307, the seals were broken. The orders inside were unambiguous. All members of the Order of the Temple were to be arrested immediately, their properties seized, their records confiscated. Resistance was to be met with force. No explanation was required beyond the charge of heresy. Across the kingdom, soldiers moved simultaneously. In cities, towns, and rural estates, the same scene repeated itself. Templars were pulled from beds, interrupted at prayer, seized while performing daily duties. There was confusion but little resistance. Most knights did not fight. Some believed it was a misunderstanding. Others assumed it was a test of obedience. Few imagined the scale of what was happening. By the time the sun fully rose, the order in France had been neutralized. The choice of date was not accidental. Friday carried religious significance. The number 13 already held ominous associations in medieval culture. Whether Philip intended symbolic resonance or simply practical coordination, the effect was lasting. The date itself would become part of the legend. Jacques de Molay, Grand Master of the Order, was arrested in Paris without struggle. Only days earlier, he had walked beside Philip at a royal funeral. He had trusted the king completely. That trust now lay in ruins. With the arrests complete, the second phase began, narrative control. Royal proclamations announced the discovery of shocking crimes. The language was moral, righteous, and severe. The king expressed sorrow at the betrayal of the faith. He framed his actions as reluctant but necessary. By the time the public absorbed the news, the Templars were already in prison. There was no opportunity to hear their side. Documents were seized en masse. Archives were searched. Seals were broken. Anything that could be interpreted as suspicious was taken. Anything that could defend the order was quietly set aside. The goal was not understanding, but confirmation. Interrogations began almost immediately. Templars were isolated, denied contact with one another. Familiar routines were stripped away. The discipline that had once sustained them now worked against them. Obedience made them compliant. Silence made them vulnerable. They had been trained to trust authority. Now authority demanded confession. Torture was not introduced as a last resort. It was built into the process. Medieval legal practice accepted pain as a means of extracting truth. Philip ensured its liberal application. Confessions were expected quickly, and they came. Men broke. Some confessed to acts they did not understand. Others repeated phrases suggested by interrogators. A few tried to resist, clinging to silence, but the methods were relentless. Fire, stretching, suffocation, each was applied with clinical precision. The resulting confessions were inconsistent, but they shared key themes. Denial of Christ, spitting on the cross, idol worship, secret rites. These themes were enough. Specifics were unnecessary. Philip's agents recorded everything. These records would later be presented as proof. The fact that confessions were obtained under torture was acknowledged, but dismissed. Pain was considered a purifier. Truth, it was believed, emerged when resistance was broken. The speed of the process prevented reflection. There was no time for legal debate or theological inquiry. By the time doubts arose, the narrative had solidified. The trap was not only physical, it was psychological. The Templars had no clear strategy for defense. They had never imagined facing such accusations from within Christendom. Their rule offered no guidance for public trial. Their loyalty to the Church made open defiance unthinkable. To accuse the king of malice would have sounded like guilt. Some believed the Pope would intervene. Others trusted that truth would prevail. Both assumptions proved fatal. As weeks turned into months, the arrests spread beyond France under pressure. Some rulers complied reluctantly. Others resisted, but the damage was done. The image of the Templars as heretics had crossed borders. Within France, the order ceased to function. Commanderies stood empty. Horses and arms were confiscated. Wealth flowed into royal coffers. What had taken generations to build collapsed in a season. Philip maintained pressure on the papacy, presenting the confessions as evidence too grave to ignore. Clement V hesitated, uneasy with the methods and motives involved. But hesitation offered no refuge. The king's resolve was absolute. The trap was complete when the Church, under duress, agreed to investigate. What began as a royal action became an ecclesiastical one. This shift gave the proceedings legitimacy and sealed the order's fate. From that point on, acquittal was impossible. Even when some Templars recanted their confessions, claiming they had lied under torture, it changed nothing. Recantation was framed as relapse into heresy. The logic was circular and unbreakable. The brilliance of the trap lay in its simplicity. The Templars were accused of crimes so repugnant that defense felt inappropriate. To argue details would appear evasive. To deny outright would seem implausible in the face of so many confessions. The order had been disarmed not just physically, but morally. Years later, observers would marvel at how quickly the Templars fell. But the fall was only sudden on the surface. Beneath it lay careful planning, political calculation, and an understanding of institutional weakness. The Templars were strongest in unity. Philip shattered that unity in a single morning. They were strongest in silence. Philip turned silence into suspicion. They were strongest in faith. Philip reframed faith as fanaticism. By the time the fires were lit, the outcome felt inevitable. The trap had not merely captured men. It had captured the story and rewritten it beyond recovery. The cells were not designed for justice. They were designed for submission. Cold stone, low light, and the constant awareness of isolation broke men long before pain was applied. The Templars, once accustomed to communal life and rigid routine, found themselves alone with uncertainty. Days blurred. Prayer became difficult without structure. Even the strongest discipline frayed when time itself lost meaning. Interrogations followed a calculated rhythm. At first, questions were gentle, almost sympathetic. Officials spoke of concern for the soul, of the chance for repentance. They hinted that cooperation would lead to mercy. Many Templars, still believing in the fairness of Christian authority, answered honestly. They denied the accusations calmly, trusting that truth would be recognized. It was not. When denials persisted, the tone shifted. The language of care gave way to insistence. Interrogators repeated rumors as if they were established facts. They described alleged rituals in vivid detail, then asked the prisoner to confirm them. The implication was clear. Others had already confessed. Resistance was pointless. Then the instruments were introduced. Torture in medieval France was not improvised. It was methodical, sanctioned, and recorded. Ropes were tightened until joints screamed. Limbs were stretched beyond natural limits. Fire licked skin slowly, deliberately. Pain was applied not in a single burst, but in waves, allowing the victim to contemplate relief just out of reach. The goal was not immediate confession. It was compliance. Under such conditions, the human mind seeks escape. Memory becomes unreliable. Imagination fills gaps. Words are offered not because they are true, but because they are expected. Many Templars confessed to what they believed interrogators wanted to hear. Some repeated accusations verbatim. Others constructed narratives from fragments of rumor and fear. These confessions, though contradictory, were accepted eagerly. Once a confession was secured, it was recorded as fact. The circumstances under which it was obtained mattered little. In the logic of the time, pain revealed truth by stripping away deception. That some men confessed to mutually exclusive acts did not weaken the case. It strengthened it. Diversity of detail suggested authenticity. Yet something remarkable happened amid the horror. Not all Templars broke. Some endured without confession, despite unimaginable suffering. They refused to validate accusations they believed were false. Their resistance baffled interrogators. To those trained to expect collapse, such endurance appeared unnatural, even sinister. This refusal was interpreted as proof of guilt. Others confessed under torture, then recanted once the pain stopped. They stood before ecclesiastical courts and calmly declared that their previous statements were lies, spoken only to escape agony. They spoke of the instruments, the threats, the despair. Their clarity should have raised alarms. Instead, recantation was treated as a greater crime. To retract a confession was to defy both church and crown. It implied that the process itself was flawed. Such implications were unacceptable. Those who recanted were labeled relapsed heretics, a category that carried automatic death sentences. In this way, truth became dangerous. The emotional toll of these proceedings was immense. Men who had dedicated their lives to obedience found themselves accused by the very institutions they served. Faith, once a source of strength, became a battlefield. Some questioned whether God had abandoned them. Others clung to prayer as the only remaining certainty. Accounts describe Templars who sang hymns in their cells, who whispered prayers through broken teeth, who refused to curse even as flames approached. These moments of dignity were not recorded officially. They survived only in fragments, overshadowed by confessions extracted through pain. The Church attempted to maintain an appearance of legitimacy. Ecclesiastical judges presided over trials. Legal formulas were observed, but the outcomes were predetermined. Confession meant guilt. Silence meant defiance. Recantation meant death. There was no path to innocence. The most chilling aspect of the interrogations was their focus. The questions returned again and again to belief, not actions on the battlefield, not financial dealings. Belief. Did you deny Christ? Did you spit on the cross? Did you worship an idol? Did you believe differently than the Church taught? These questions reveal the true nature of the fear driving the process. The Templars were not being punished for what they had done, but for what they might have thought. In some cases, interrogators seemed almost disappointed when prisoners knew nothing of the alleged rites. They pressed harder, insisting such ignorance was impossible. How could a member of the order not know its deepest secrets? The assumption was built into the question. Pain made certainty malleable. The psychological effect of prolonged interrogation was devastating. Men began to doubt their own memories. Did something happen that they had forgotten? Was a symbolic gesture misinterpreted? Had silence itself become guilt? This erosion of self-trust was perhaps the most effective tool of all. Yet even as bodies broke, something else endured. A quiet conviction among many Templars that whatever was happening was wrong. That justice had been replaced by theater. That confession had become currency. This conviction did not save them, but it shaped how they faced death. Public executions were meant to serve as warnings. Burnings were staged as spectacles of purification. Crowds gathered, drawn by fear and fascination. Officials proclaimed the crimes of the condemned, reinforcing the narrative. Some Templars died confessing. Others died denying. Both were treated the same. Jacques de Molay, after years of imprisonment, initially confessed under pressure. Later, standing before the crowd, he recanted publicly, declaring the order innocent. His words stunned observers. They also sealed his fate. He was burned that same day. In that moment, the logic of the trials was exposed. Truth was not what mattered. Compliance was. The confessions under flame achieved their purpose. They justified the destruction of the order. They reassured the public that justice had been done. They allowed church and crown to move forward without doubt. But they left behind an unsettling legacy. Centuries later, historians would read the trial records and see the cracks, the contradictions, the leading questions, the mechanical repetition of themes, the unmistakable fingerprints of coercion. What survived the fire was not proof of heresy, but evidence of fear. Fear of an order that could not be controlled. Fear of beliefs that could not be monitored. Fear of men who valued silence over submission. The flames consumed bodies, but they did not resolve the questions. They only deepened the mystery of what the Templars truly knew, and why so many were willing to endure agony rather than explain it. As the confessions piled up and the fires continued to burn, one question refused to disappear. It lingered beneath every accusation, every trial transcript, every execution. What knowledge could provoke such total annihilation? Gold could be seized without spectacle. Military orders could be disbanded quietly. Even corruption could be managed through reform. But this was different. This was eradication. The focus of the trials made that clear. Again and again, interrogators returned not to money or politics, but to belief. They were not obsessed with what the Templars owned. They were obsessed with what they knew. The idea that the Templars possessed forbidden knowledge did not originate with modern conspiracy. It emerged during the trials themselves. Questions were structured as if something specific was being sought, something already suspected. Interrogators asked about secret teachings, hidden doctrines, and private interpretations of Christ. These were not random lines of inquiry. They reflected a fear that had already taken shape. In medieval Christianity, knowledge was not neutral. Certain knowledge was considered dangerous by nature. Salvation history had been carefully defined. Scripture was authorized, interpreted, and bounded. Anything outside those boundaries was not simply wrong. It was destabilizing. The Church had spent centuries suppressing alternative Christian traditions. Gnostic texts were destroyed. Competing gospels were erased. Teachings that emphasized direct personal knowledge of the divine were condemned as heretical. The message was clear. Truth flowed through the Church, not around it. If the Templars had encountered remnants of these suppressed traditions, the implications would have been profound. During their time in the East, the Templars lived among diverse religious communities. They interacted with Eastern Orthodox Christians, whose theology differed subtly but significantly from Rome's. They encountered Islamic scholars who preserved ancient Greek philosophy and theology long forgotten in the West. They moved through regions where early Christianity had taken root before orthodoxy hardened. Ideas travel more easily than armies. It is not unreasonable to imagine that the Templars were exposed to interpretations of Christ that challenged Western assumptions. Not necessarily hostile interpretations, but unfamiliar ones. Christ as a teacher of wisdom rather than a legal redeemer. Salvation as transformation rather than transaction. Faith as understanding rather than obedience. Such ideas did not need to be fully adopted to be dangerous. Awareness alone could shift perspective. The trials hint at this danger. Accusations that the Templars denied Christ were often vague, inconsistent, and poorly defined. What did denial mean? Denial of divinity? Denial of institutional authority? Denial of the Church's exclusive role? In some confessions, Templars allegedly stated that Christ was not God, or that his suffering was symbolic. These statements echo debates from the earliest centuries of Christianity, long before doctrine was finalized. They suggest not atheism but alternative theology. From the Church's perspective, this was intolerable. Doctrine was not simply a matter of belief. It was the foundation of social order. The sacraments regulated life from birth to death. The Church mediated forgiveness, marriage, inheritance, and burial. If salvation could be accessed through knowledge or understanding rather than institutional ritual, the entire system would collapse. The Templars, by virtue of their discipline and secrecy, were uniquely positioned to safeguard such ideas. They did not preach publicly. They did not seek converts. They could contain dangerous knowledge within a closed circle, preserving it without spreading it. That containment may have been precisely what alarmed authorities. Knowledge hidden is knowledge protected. Some theories suggest the Templars uncovered ancient texts beneath the Temple Mount or acquired them through Eastern contacts. Texts that offered alternative accounts of early Christianity. Texts that emphasized inner enlightenment over external obedience. Whether such texts physically existed matters less than the belief that they might have. Belief alone can drive action. The accusation of idol worship may also connect to this fear. Symbols used to represent wisdom, knowledge, or divine presence could be misinterpreted as objects of worship. The infamous head, described in confessions, may not have been an idol at all, but a symbol of insight, memory, or sacred teaching. In many mystical traditions, the head represents consciousness and divine spark. To revere such a symbol would not be idolatry in intent, but it would appear so to an institution focused on external forms. The Church did not investigate these nuances, could not afford to acknowledge the possibility that the Templars possessed legitimate but suppressed knowledge would have opened questions the Church had spent centuries closing. It would have forced a confrontation with its own history of exclusion and control. Instead, the knowledge was labeled forbidden. Forbidden knowledge does not need to be false. It needs only to threaten authority. The Templars' silence during the trials reinforces this interpretation. Men will endure torture to protect loved ones, honor, or faith, but few endure it to protect lies. The willingness of many Templars to suffer without explanation suggests they believed disclosure would cause greater harm than death. Harm to what? Perhaps to the order itself. Perhaps to the Church. Perhaps to the fragile balance of belief that held medieval society together. It is also possible that the knowledge was not a single revelation, but a way of seeing. A framework that allowed the Templars to reconcile faith with reason, devotion with inquiry. Such a framework would not fit neatly into trial transcripts. It would resist interrogation because it was experiential, not doctrinal. How do you confess to perspective? Interrogators demanded statements. They wanted sentences that could be written, judged, and condemned. The Templars, if they possessed something more subtle, could not translate it into those terms without distortion. And distortion would have been betrayal. The Church's response reveals its priorities. Instead of seeking clarity, it sought closure. Instead of inquiry, it chose elimination. Whatever the Templars knew, it was deemed safer destroyed than understood. This decision echoes through history. Knowledge that cannot be controlled is often labeled dangerous. Institutions rarely differentiate between falsehood and independence. Both threaten stability. The irony is that by attempting to erase the forbidden knowledge, the Church ensured its survival in legend. The more violently the Templars were silenced, the more compelling the mystery became. Questions multiplied where answers were denied. What if the Templars did not threaten Christianity, but a specific version of it? What if their crime was not heresy, but autonomy of belief? The trials never answered these questions. They were not designed to. Their purpose was to end the matter, not to explore it. Yet the very intensity of the response suggests the stakes were higher than politics or wealth. Entire institutions do not mobilize to destroy a group unless they fear something fundamental. The forbidden knowledge, whatever its exact nature, struck at the heart of authority. It challenged who had the right to define truth. And that challenge, in any age, is the most dangerous secret of all. Among all the accusations leveled against the Templars, none proved as enduring or as bewildering as the name that surfaced again and again in trial records: Baphomet. It appeared suddenly, without explanation, spoken by men under extreme pressure, recorded by interrogators who already believed they knew what it meant. And yet, for all its power to shock, no one at the time could clearly define it. That ambiguity was precisely what made it so dangerous. The word itself seemed foreign, unsettling to medieval ears. Some claimed it was the name of a demon. Others insisted it referred to an idol worshipped in secret. Interrogators treated it as proof of apostasy, while the public absorbed it as evidence of dark, hidden practices. But when historians later examined the testimonies, they found not clarity, but chaos. Descriptions of Baphomet varied wildly. One witness described a severed head with a beard. Another spoke of a head with two faces. Some said it was metallic, others wooden. A few claimed it could speak. Others that it granted wealth or protection. There was no agreement on size, shape, material, or function. If Baphomet were a literal idol, such contradictions would be difficult to explain. Medieval worship, even of forbidden objects, tended to be consistent. Idols had forms, names, rituals. What appeared in the Templar trials was not a coherent object, but a fragmented idea. That fragmentation suggests misunderstanding. The men being questioned were often exhausted, terrified, and in pain. Interrogators asked leading questions, sometimes introducing the term themselves. Did you worship the head called Baphomet? When a man answered yes, anything to stop the agony, the word entered the record as confirmation. Over time, repetition hardened suggestion into fact. Yet even torture cannot conjure something from nothing. The persistence of the name implies it had some root in the order's internal language, or at least in the imagination of those who observed it from the outside. To understand why it frightened the Church so deeply, one must look beyond literal interpretations. One theory suggests that Baphomet was a corruption of Muhammad, the medieval European rendering of Muhammad. During the Crusades, Christians frequently accused Muslims of idol worship, believing they venerated Muhammad as a god. This was false, but the misconception was widespread. If the Templars had adopted certain Eastern practices or terms, even innocently, they could have been misinterpreted through this lens. But this explanation feels incomplete. It reduces Baphomet to a linguistic error, when the emotional reaction it provoked was far more intense. Another interpretation views Baphomet as symbolic rather than physical. In medieval thought, symbols were not secondary to reality. They were expressions of it. A symbol could carry meaning more potent than any object. If the Templars used a symbol representing wisdom, knowledge, or divine insight, especially one not sanctioned by the Church, it would have appeared threatening. The Church tolerated symbols only when it controlled their interpretation. A symbol without official explanation was a rival authority. The repeated emphasis on a head is telling. Across cultures, the head represents consciousness, intellect, and identity. In Christian tradition, Christ is described as the head of the Church. To revere a head, symbolically could be interpreted as shifting authority away from Christ as defined by Rome. In mystical traditions, the head also represents gnosis, knowledge of divine truth. To honor knowledge itself, rather than institutional mediation, would have been radical. If Baphomet was such a symbol, it would not have been worshipped as a god. It would have been contemplated, respected, perhaps even revered as a representation of insight. But nuance does not survive interrogation. The Church did not ask what Baphomet meant. It asked whether it existed. And once men said yes, the meaning was irrelevant. Later centuries would reinterpret Baphomet through entirely different lenses. Occultists in the 19th century famously depicted it as a horned, androgynous figure, blending opposites. Male and female, human and animal, light and dark. This image, popularized long after the Templars were gone, says more about modern symbolism than medieval reality. Yet the fascination endured because the name had never been resolved. Why would an order so devoted to Christ risk everything to worship a demon? The question itself reveals the flaw. It assumes the accusation was accurate rather than constructed. The Church's fear was not of demon worship. It was of unauthorized meaning. The Templars' internal culture relied on symbolism, discipline, and silence. Symbols functioned as teaching tools, not objects of devotion. A misunderstood symbol, removed from its context, could easily appear sinister. During the trials, no effort was made to clarify context. Confessions mentioning Baphomet were accepted without examination. No physical artifact was conclusively produced. No consistent ritual was described. The absence of evidence did not weaken the case. It strengthened suspicion. Heresy in this framework was not something to be proven. It was something to be affirmed. The Church had faced symbolic threats before. The Cathars were accused of secret rites and inverted beliefs. The same language of hidden idols and false gods was used against them. In each case, complexity was reduced to transgression. Baphomet fit neatly into this pattern. What made it especially potent was its unknowability. It could not be easily explained or dismissed. It hovered at the edge of understanding, allowing fear to fill the gaps. From a psychological perspective, this was ideal. A vague enemy is more terrifying than a defined one. The public did not need to know what Baphomet was. They needed only to believe it was dangerous. For the Templars, this accusation was particularly devastating because it struck at their identity. They had defined themselves as defenders of the faith. To be labeled idol worshippers was not just false, it was annihilating. Yet many still refused to explain. This refusal suggests that whatever lay behind the symbol was not something they believed could be defended in that context. Not because it was evil, but because it would be misunderstood. The trial environment allowed only binary categories: orthodox or heretical, faithful or damned. Symbols that lived in between had no chance. If Baphomet represented knowledge, balance, or inner understanding, to explain it would have required challenging the framework of the trial itself. That was impossible. The Church, for its part, had no interest in resolving the mystery. Ambiguity served its purpose. It allowed the Templars to be condemned without engaging their inner world. The symbol became a weapon. In destroying the order, the Church also destroyed the possibility of clarification. Whatever Baphomet truly meant, if it meant anything at all, was lost with the men who might have explained it. And so the name remained, echoing through history as a question rather than an answer. Was it a demon, an idol, a misunderstanding, or a symbol stripped of its meaning? The trials ensured that no definitive conclusion would ever be reached. The symbol was severed from its source, leaving only accusation behind. In that sense, Baphomet became exactly what the Church feared: a piece of forbidden knowledge that survived not through preservation, but through suppression. Because what is never explained is never fully erased. Long before the word heresy became a sentence of death, Christianity had been a landscape of competing voices. In its earliest centuries, belief was fluid, contested, and deeply philosophical. Questions about the nature of Christ, salvation, and divine knowledge were not only debated, they defined communities. It was from this turbulent beginning that the shadow later labeled Gnostic emerged, and it is within this shadow that many believe the deepest fear surrounding the Templars was rooted. Gnosticism was never a single religion. It was a spectrum of ideas that shared one dangerous assumption: that divine truth could be known directly, not granted by institutions, not mediated by priests. No, salvation, in this view, came through insight, gnosis, rather than obedience alone. The divine spark existed within, waiting to be awakened. For the early church, this idea was intolerable. If individuals could access God without intermediaries, the authority of bishops, sacraments, and hierarchy collapsed. To survive, the church defined orthodoxy by exclusion. Gnostic texts were condemned, burned, or buried. Alternative gospels vanished from public knowledge. What remained was a carefully curated canon, interpreted through sanctioned channels. By the time medieval Europe emerged, these debates were considered settled. Gnosticism was a dead heresy, safely buried in the past. Or so it seemed. The Crusader East was not a theological vacuum. It was a crossroads where cultures, religions, and philosophies intersected. Ancient texts preserved by Islamic scholars circulated quietly. Eastern Christian traditions retained theological nuances Rome had long rejected. The memory of alternative Christian narratives had not vanished. It had simply gone underground. The Templars, uniquely positioned within this environment, were exposed to these currents. They were educated, disciplined, and curious by necessity. They negotiated, observed, and lived among peoples whose understanding of faith differed from their own. Exposure alone does not equal adoption, but it does invite comparison. Comparison breeds reflection. If a Templar encountered the idea that Christ was a revealer of wisdom rather than a legal sacrifice, it would not necessarily weaken his faith. It might deepen it, but it would also complicate it. Faith would become something to be understood, not merely received. Such a shift could not be expressed publicly. Within the order, however, it could be contained. The Templars' hierarchical structure and emphasis on secrecy created an ideal environment for preserving unorthodox ideas without spreading them. Knowledge could be layered, revealed only to those prepared for it. This is the essence of the Gnostic shadow. Not overt rebellion, but quiet alternative understanding. The trials offer hints of this shadow. Accusations that the Templars believed Christ was not fully divine, or that his suffering was symbolic, echo Gnostic theology. Claims that they valued knowledge over ritual resonate deeply. Even the obsession with secret initiation aligns with traditions that reserved deeper truths for the initiated. To the Church, these echoes were terrifying. The medieval Church had spent centuries asserting that salvation flowed through its structures. Sacraments were not symbols, they were mechanisms. Priests were not guides, they were gatekeepers. Any theology that bypassed this system was not merely incorrect, it was an existential threat. The Templars, whether intentionally or not, embodied that threat. They did not rely on parish priests for spiritual discipline. They followed their own rule. Their confessions were internal. Their faith was practiced collectively, without constant clerical supervision. This autonomy alone was enough to unsettle Rome. If, within that autonomy, they also preserved ideas that questioned institutional mediation, the danger multiplied. The Church did not need proof of Gnosticism to fear it. The pattern was familiar. Groups that emphasized inner knowledge had always resisted control. They were harder to discipline, harder to tax, harder to silence. History had taught the Church that such groups must be crushed early, before they could inspire others. It is important to note that there is no definitive evidence that the Templars were Gnostics in the formal sense. They did not openly reject the Church. They did not circulate banned texts. They did not preach heresy. But fear does not require certainty. The very possibility that the Templars had inherited or rediscovered suppressed traditions was enough. Their silence, their symbols, their discipline, all could be interpreted through a Gnostic lens once suspicion took hold. Even their alleged denial of the cross fits this pattern. In Gnostic thought, the crucifixion was often seen as symbolic, not salvific. The material world was flawed. Spiritual truth lay beyond physical suffering. To symbolically reject the cross could be seen not as blasphemy, but as a rejection of material misunderstanding. Such nuance was impossible in a courtroom. The Church's response was shaped by memory. It remembered how difficult it had been to extinguish early heresies. It remembered how ideas could spread quietly, beneath persecution, surviving through secrecy and devotion. The Templars looked uncomfortably similar. Their discipline resembled monastic rigor, but their secrecy suggested something more. Their loyalty was unquestioned, but their obedience was internal. Their faith was visible, but its foundations were opaque. This ambiguity made them intolerable. The irony is that the Church's fear may have exaggerated the threat. The Templars may not have intended to challenge doctrine at all. Their internal reflections could have remained personal, contained, harmless. But institutions rarely distinguish between potential and intent. By labeling the Templars heretical, the Church projected its own anxieties onto them. The Gnostic shadow became a justification rather than a diagnosis. It allowed the Church to frame destruction as defense. In doing so, it avoided confronting deeper questions about faith, authority, and knowledge. What if belief could exist outside rigid structures? What if devotion did not require constant oversight? What if understanding deepened faith rather than undermining it? These questions, more than any idol or ritual, lay at the heart of the fear. The Templars, by their existence, asked them silently. And for an institution built on answers, not questions, silence was unforgivable. So the shadow was named, condemned, and erased. But shadows do not vanish when light is forced upon them. They retreat, reshaping themselves in memory and myth. The Gnostic shadow did not die with the Templars. It became part of the mystery they left behind. An unanswered possibility that continues to unsettle history, not because it proves heresy, but because it suggests that faith once had more than one voice. By the time the formal proceedings began, the outcome was already decided. The trials that followed were not designed to discover truth, but to confirm a conclusion reached long before any testimony was heard. The structure of the process made this painfully clear. There was no presumption of innocence, no neutral ground on which the accused could stand. The Templars entered the courtroom already condemned by reputation, confession, and political necessity. Ecclesiastical councils convened with an air of solemn inevitability. Bishops, theologians, and royal representatives gathered beneath vaulted ceilings, their discussions framed as careful deliberation. Yet the questions asked were narrow, repetitive, and accusatory. They did not ask whether the accusations were true. They asked why the accused continued to deny them. The Church attempted to balance appearances. It wanted to seem just methodical, restrained. Canon law was cited. Procedures were observed. But beneath this ritual of legality lay a deeper pressure. The crown demanded results. The papacy needed resolution. Delay was interpreted as weakness, doubt as complicity. The Templars were allowed to speak, but only within limits. They could respond to charges, but they could not challenge the legitimacy of the process itself. Any attempt to do so was interpreted as defiance. Their words were weighed not against evidence, but against expectations. Confessions extracted under torture were treated as the cornerstone of the case. When Templars later claimed these confessions were false, spoken under unbearable pain, the courts faced a dilemma. To acknowledge the unreliability of torture would undermine the entire process. So the claims were dismissed. Pain, it was argued, revealed truth by stripping away deceit. That some men confessed only to recant later was framed not as proof of coercion, but as evidence of spiritual instability. Logic bent to necessity. In some regions outside France, the proceedings unfolded differently. English and German authorities were more skeptical. Torture was applied less aggressively. Confessions were fewer. Many Templars maintained their innocence and were quietly absolved or assigned penance rather than death. These discrepancies should have raised questions. Instead, they were ignored. The Church faced an uncomfortable contradiction. If the Templars were truly heretics, why did guilt appear so unevenly across borders? Why did confession seem to correlate with methods rather than truth? The only way to resolve this contradiction was to centralize the narrative. France became the standard. All other outcomes were treated as anomalies. The papacy attempted to regain control by initiating its own inquiry. Pope Clement V convened commissions, heard testimonies, and expressed doubt. At times, he appeared genuinely troubled by the proceedings. He suspended torture briefly. He questioned the validity of some confessions. But these gestures came too late. Philip IV exerted relentless pressure. He reminded the Pope of political realities, of alliances, of vulnerability. The Church, already weakened by internal divisions and external threats, could not afford open conflict with the French crown. The trial of the Templars became a test of authority, not theology. Under this pressure, the papacy shifted its position. Rather than declare the Templars guilty of heresy outright, a claim that required proof, it dissolved the order through administrative decree. The language was careful. The order was not condemned for proven crimes, but suppressed for the good of the Church and to avoid scandal. This distinction mattered legally. It allowed the Church to sidestep the question of guilt while achieving the same result. The Templars ceased to exist. For the men still imprisoned, this decision offered no relief. Many had already been executed. Others languished in cells, awaiting sentences that now seemed inevitable. The order they had served was gone. Their identity had been erased. Those who continued to defend the order faced the harshest consequences. To maintain innocence after dissolution was seen as obstinacy. Some were sentenced to life imprisonment. Others were burned as relapsed heretics. Their refusal to accept the narrative framed as further proof of guilt. The trial had become a closed system. Any response reinforced the accusation. The emotional toll was profound. Templars who had survived torture now faced despair. The institution that had given their lives meaning was gone. Brotherhood was replaced by isolation. Silence by futility. Yet even in this broken state, some refused to comply. Jacques de Molay's final stand remains the most haunting example. After years of imprisonment, he was brought before a public assembly to hear his sentence. Expected to confirm his earlier confession, he instead declared the order innocent and recanted every admission of guilt. His voice, witnesses said, was calm. The reaction was immediate. He was declared a relapsed heretic and condemned to death without further trial. The machinery of justice, having no room for deviation, moved swiftly. This moment exposed the truth of the proceedings more clearly than any document. Innocence was not an option. The trial could not be won because it was not meant to be contested. The Church justified its actions as preservation. The crown framed them as righteousness. Together, they produced an outcome that satisfied both power and perception. But justice was absent. What was lost in the process was not just an order, but the possibility of truth. The Templars were never allowed to explain themselves fully, not because they lacked words, but because no one was listening. The trial demanded confession, not understanding. In the end, the Templars were not defeated by evidence. They were defeated by inevitability. The convergence of fear, ambition, and institutional self-preservation made their survival impossible. History would later debate their guilt or innocence. Scholars would analyze records, dissect confessions, and argue over interpretations. But for the men who stood before those medieval courts, such debates were irrelevant. Their fate had been sealed the moment the question shifted from, "What is true?" to "What must be done?" And once that shift occurred, the trial ceased to be a search for justice. It became a ritual of erasure. Jacques de Molay was not born into legend. He entered the world as a minor noble in eastern France, a man of modest rank and conventional piety. Like many of his class, he sought purpose through service, and the Order of the Temple offered both structure and meaning. When he joined, the Templars were still revered, their mission clear, their reputation intact. No prophecy marked his path. Nothing suggested he would become the final symbol of an ending centuries in the making. By the time de Molay rose to the position of Grand Master, the world had changed. The Crusader states were crumbling. Acre, the last major Christian stronghold in the Holy Land, had fallen. The dream that had once justified the Order's existence was gone. Yet de Molay did not abandon his role. He believed the Templars still had a future, perhaps reformed, perhaps redirected, but alive. He was not a radical. He did not challenge the church openly. He did not seek confrontation with kings. His leadership was cautious, rooted in loyalty to tradition. When proposals arose to merge the Templars with other military orders, de Molay resisted, not out of pride, but conviction. The order, he believed, had its own identity, its own rule, its own purpose. That belief would cost him everything. When Philip IV summoned him to Paris in 1307, de Molay had no reason to suspect danger. He had attended royal ceremonies, walked beside the king, and trusted in the bonds of Christian fraternity. He even supported an inquiry into the order's practices, confident that truth would clear them. This confidence, born of decades of service, now seems tragically naive. His arrest came without warning. Chains replaced ceremony. Accusations replaced dialogue. The man who had commanded knights across continents found himself alone in a cell, stripped of authority and certainty. The interrogations were relentless. De Molay was subjected to the same methods as his brothers. Pain, isolation, and exhaustion wore him down. Under torture, he confessed to some of the charges. The words were recorded, repeated, and used against him. For his accusers, this confession was triumph. For de Molay, it was a moment of collapse. But collapse did not mean surrender. In the years that followed, de Molay lived in limbo. The order he had led was dismantled piece by piece. Brothers disappeared into prisons or graves. Properties were seized. Symbols erased. The world he had known was unrecognizable. During this time, de Molay reflected. Accounts suggest he wrestled deeply with guilt, not for imagined heresy, but for having spoken under torture. Confession had saved him temporarily, but it had betrayed the order he loved. Silence, he realized too late, would have been the truer obedience. As proceedings dragged on, de Molay's resolve hardened. When he was brought before ecclesiastical authorities years later, the expectation was clear. He would reaffirm his confession, accept penance, and disappear quietly into history. The machinery of erasure depended on compliance. Instead, he chose defiance. Standing before clergy and officials, de Molay recanted his confession publicly. He declared the charges false. He affirmed the innocence of the order. His words were not shouted. They were spoken calmly, deliberately, with full awareness of the consequences. In that moment, de Molay reclaimed his identity. The reaction was swift. There was no debate, no pause for reflection. Recantation transformed him from a repentant sinner into a relapsed heretic. The sentence was death by fire, to be carried out immediately. On March 18, 1314, Jacques de Molay was taken to an island in the Seine, within sight of Notre Dame. Pyre was prepared. Crowds gathered, drawn by the final act of a drama that had consumed Europe. Witnesses described his composure. He faced the flames not as a man broken, but as one resolved. As the fire was lit, he spoke words that would echo through history. He called upon God to judge those who had wronged the order. He summoned the Pope and the King to answer before the divine court within a year. Whether these words were a curse or a prayer remains open to interpretation. What matters is their timing. They were spoken at the moment when earthly authority had exhausted itself. De Molay placed judgment beyond the reach of institutions that had failed him. Within months, Pope Clement V was dead. Within the year, King Philip IV followed. Medieval chroniclers saw in these deaths confirmation of divine justice. Modern historians caution against such conclusions. Yet symbolism does not require causation to be powerful. De Molay's death transformed him. In life, he had been a cautious administrator. In death, he became a symbol of integrity reclaimed. His final stand reframed the narrative of the Templars. They were no longer simply victims of political maneuvering. They were witnesses to a deeper injustice. What de Molay defended in his final moments was not wealth or power. It was memory, the memory of an order that had served faithfully, believed sincerely, and been destroyed not for its crimes, but for its inconvenience. His silence under flame spoke louder than any confession under torture. The image of the Grand Master standing unbroken before fire became an indictment of the process that condemned him. It exposed the fragility of authority built on fear. Institutions could control bodies but not meaning. In that sense, de Molay's death was not the end of the Templars. It was their transformation. The order vanished from official history, but its story deepened. Martyrdom replaced administration. Symbol replaced structure. The man who had once negotiated with kings now judged them from memory. De Molay did not live to see the long-term consequences of his stand. He did not know that his name would be whispered in legends, that his final words would be remembered as prophecy, that his composure would haunt the institutions that destroyed him. But in choosing truth over survival, he ensured that the Templars would not be remembered solely as heretics. They would be remembered as men who faced annihilation and, at the last moment, refused to surrender the meaning of their lives. And in that refusal, Jacques de Molay became more than the last Grand Master. He became the voice the flames could not silence. After the flames died down on the island in the Seine, Paris returned to its routines. The crowd dispersed. The river flowed on. Officially, the matter was closed. The Order of the Temple was gone, its last Grand Master reduced to ash. For the Church and the Crown, this should have been the end of the story. But history rarely ends where power intends it to. Almost immediately, a different narrative began to circulate. Quiet at first, spoken in low voices, it carried an unease that official proclamations could not suppress. Jacques de Molay's final words had not been forgotten. Witnesses repeated them with subtle variations, but the core remained the same. A summons, a judgment, a reckoning. He had not pleaded. He had not cursed wildly. He had called his judges to answer before God. In a deeply religious society, such words carried weight. When Pope Clement V fell ill shortly after de Molay's execution, the timing unsettled even the most skeptical observers. Clement had been cautious, hesitant, caught between conscience and pressure. He had not ordered the fire himself, but he had allowed it. His death in April 1314, just weeks after the execution, was officially attributed to natural causes. Yet coincidence has never been comforting to those who sense moral imbalance. The unease deepened when King Philip IV died that same year. Philip was only 46. He had been robust, active, and seemingly secure. His sudden death in November shocked the court. Chroniclers, never neutral observers, connected the events immediately. The king who had orchestrated the destruction of the Templars had followed their Grand Master into the grave within the year. For medieval minds, this was not chance. It was judgment. Stories spread rapidly. Some claimed de Molay's curse had been fulfilled precisely as spoken. Others embellished, asserting that the king and pope had been named explicitly. Each retelling sharpened the sense that something cosmic had occurred. Whether the deaths were coincidental or not is, in a modern sense, irrelevant. What mattered was how they were perceived. The curse narrative transformed the fall of the Templars from a political maneuver into a moral drama. It suggested that earthly power had overreached, and that divine justice had responded where human courts had failed. This interpretation resonated deeply with a population already uneasy about the trials. The Church attempted to downplay the connection. Official records remained silent on curses and prophecy. But silence could not erase popular belief. The story took on a life of its own, passing from chroniclers to poets, from sermons to whispered conversation. Philip's dynasty soon faltered. His sons reigned briefly, one after another, each dying without securing lasting stability. Within a generation, the Capetian line was in crisis. To later observers, this seemed like further confirmation that the king's actions had invited disaster. Again, causation mattered less than symbolism. The idea of a curse spoke to a deeper need. It restored balance to a narrative that had felt unjust. If the Templars could not be saved in life, they could be vindicated in death. The curse offered closure where courts had offered none. It also reframed Jacques de Molay. No longer merely a condemned heretic or a stubborn old man, he became a prophetic figure. His final stand took on biblical overtones. Like ancient martyrs, he had spoken truth to power and sealed it with his life. This transformation unsettled authorities. The Church preferred saints it could canonize and control. De Molay did not fit that pattern. He was not officially sanctified. His memory could not be neatly incorporated into doctrine. Yet his story persisted precisely because it resisted official framing. The curse narrative also reinforced the idea that the Templars' destruction had been a moral error. If God himself had responded, then the trials were not just flawed, they were sinful. For those who had benefited from the order's fall, this was uncomfortable. Wealth had changed hands. Power had consolidated. To accept the curse as meaningful would be to question the legitimacy of those gains. So the story remained unofficial, existing in the space between history and myth. Over time, the curse became part of a broader legend surrounding the Templars. It blended with tales of hidden treasure, secret survival, and forbidden knowledge. Each element reinforced the others. The more the order was erased from official memory, the more vivid it became in popular imagination. This is how martyrs are made. The irony is that the curse narrative likely did more to preserve the Templars' legacy than any document or defense could have. It gave their story emotional resolution. It suggested that power could be challenged not only through force, but through integrity. In the centuries that followed, writers and historians would debate the reality of the curse. Some dismissed it as superstition. Others treated it as coincidence magnified by storytelling. But even skeptics acknowledged its cultural impact. The deaths of Philip and Clement closed a chapter. The architects of the Templars' destruction did not live to enjoy long triumphs. Their end felt abrupt, unfinished. The story lacked the satisfaction of victory, and in that absence the curse thrived. It became a warning encoded in history, a reminder that institutions, however powerful, are not immune to moral consequence. That destruction justified by fear can return as doubt. That silencing a group does not silence the questions they raise. The curse also served another purpose. It shifted attention away from the specifics of doctrine and toward the ethics of power. Whether the Templars were orthodox or not became less important than whether they had been treated justly. In this way, the legend softened theological debate into moral reflection. What followed the curse was not reform or repentance, but forgetting. The Church moved on. New orders rose. New conflicts demanded attention. The Templars faded from official discourse, their properties redistributed, their name rarely spoken. Yet forgetting was incomplete. In stories told by firelight, in marginal notes of chronicles, in the lingering unease surrounding Friday the 13th, the memory endured. The curse ensured that the end of the Templars would never feel settled. It left history with a question rather than a conclusion. Were the deaths of the Pope and the King divine retribution, or coincidence magnified by guilt? Did Jacques de Molay speak prophecy, or did people need him to have done so? The answers remain elusive, but the impact is clear. The curse transformed the destruction of the Templars from a historical event into a moral symbol. It suggested that even when institutions win, they may lose something more enduring: legitimacy. And it ensured that the final chapter of the order would not be written by those who destroyed it, but by those who remembered it with doubt, awe, and unease. In the end, the flames did not purify the story. They ignited it. When the royal officials finally gained access to the Templar treasuries, they expected revelation. They had arrested hundreds of men, dismantled an order that spanned continents, and justified the violence with accusations of immense wealth and secret hoarding. What they found instead was absence. Vaults that should have been overflowing were orderly but sparse. Records existed, but not the kind that explained everything. The treasure that legend promised was simply not there. This absence was as unsettling as any confession. The Templars had been Europe's most sophisticated financial institution. They moved money across borders, safeguarded royal funds, and managed estates with precision. Their Paris temple was considered one of the safest repositories in the kingdom. If anyone possessed vast reserves of gold, it should have been them. Yet when the arrests came, much of that wealth had already vanished. Royal authorities offered practical explanations. Assets had been transferred. Funds were tied up in properties. War and administration had drained reserves. On paper, these explanations made sense. But paper was exactly what people distrusted. The idea that so much wealth could dissolve so completely invited speculation. Speculation quickly became legend. Stories spread that the Templars had anticipated their downfall, that they had moved their treasure in secret under cover of night, that ships had departed from French ports days before the arrests, carrying chests of gold, sacred relics, or forbidden texts. No records confirmed this, but no records disproved it either. The absence of evidence became evidence itself. Some claimed the treasure had been hidden in remote fortresses, sealed behind stone and silence. Others suggested it had been divided, entrusted to surviving brothers who melted back into society. The idea that the Templars had outwitted their enemies was deeply appealing, especially to those who believed the order had been wronged. Treasure, in this context, became more than gold. It became symbolic. It represented everything that had been taken unjustly: wealth, knowledge, dignity. To imagine it surviving somewhere beyond the reach of king and pope was to imagine that the destruction had been incomplete. This symbolism deepened with time. As centuries passed, the missing treasure attracted new interpretations. Some believed it included sacred relics connected to Christ, objects of immense spiritual power. Others thought it was purely financial, a fortune capable of reshaping kingdoms. A few suggested it was neither gold nor relic, but documents. Records of forbidden knowledge, alternative histories, suppressed truths. The lack of clarity allowed every theory to coexist. What is often overlooked is how plausible some degree of preparation actually was. The Templars were disciplined, cautious, and experienced in crisis management. They operated in hostile territories where sudden loss was always a possibility. Contingency planning was part of their culture. It is not unreasonable to believe they had protocols for safeguarding assets in times of danger. However, the scale of the arrests makes full preparation unlikely. The speed and coordination caught even senior leaders by surprise. Jacques de Molay himself appeared unaware of any imminent threat. If a plan existed, it would have been executed by regional commanders acting independently, not through central coordination. This decentralization complicates the story. Instead of a single hidden hoard, there may have been many small ones. Funds redirected quietly, assets absorbed into other institutions, wealth transformed rather than concealed. Over time, these resources would lose their identity as Templar treasure and become indistinguishable from other holdings. But legend resists such mundane explanations. The idea of a singular, lost treasure appeals because it promises resolution. It suggests that something tangible remains to be found, something that can vindicate the past. In reality, the most valuable things the Templars possessed were not easily buried. Their true wealth lay in networks, knowledge, and trust. These are difficult to confiscate. Even as properties were seized, many Templar administrators were absorbed into other orders or secular roles. Their expertise did not disappear. It migrated. The Church redistributed some assets to the Knights Hospitaller, another military order, effectively preserving the institutional function if not the name. From one perspective, the treasure was not lost at all. It was repurposed. But this explanation does not satisfy the deeper unease. People did not want to know where the gold went. They wanted to know whether the Templars had preserved something forbidden, something that justified the fear, the trials, the destruction. The missing treasure became a placeholder for that unknown. In later centuries, as interest in the Templars revived, treasure hunts became metaphors for truth-seeking. Explorers searched ruins, chapels, and caves, convinced that stone and earth hid answers history had denied. Each failure reinforced the myth. If nothing could be found, perhaps it was because the treasure was never meant to be recovered. Perhaps it had been hidden in plain sight. The idea that the Templars' real legacy was intangible gained traction. Their discipline influenced later organizations. Their symbols reappeared in unexpected places. Their story inspired movements that valued secrecy, brotherhood, and internal truth. In this sense, the treasure survived as an idea. The Church's attempt to erase the order inadvertently amplified its mystique. By confiscating visible wealth, it drew attention to invisible inheritance. By silencing voices, it encouraged speculation. The missing treasure became a question mark etched into history. What had been lost? What had been saved? The absence of definitive answers ensured the story's survival. Even skeptics must acknowledge the psychological power of disappearance. When something expected is missing, the mind fills the gap. In the case of the Templars, the gap was vast. It spanned continents, centuries, and belief systems. Gold may or may not have been hidden. Relics may or may not have existed. Documents may or may not have survived. But the belief that something escaped destruction became a form of resistance. It denied the finality of power. The Church and Crown sought closure. They wanted the Templars finished, their story concluded. The missing treasure refused that ending. It suggested unfinished business, unresolved truth. In that sense, the treasure's greatest value was not material. It was narrative. It kept the Templars alive in memory, not as defeated heretics, but as custodians of something withheld. It allowed later generations to question the official story, to imagine alternatives, to resist the idea that authority always prevails. The irony is striking. By destroying the order, its enemies created the conditions for its immortality. The missing treasure ensured that the Templars would never be fully explained, only endlessly pursued. And perhaps that was the final act of defiance. Not gold buried in stone, but meaning buried in silence. A treasure that could not be seized, because it existed wherever questions remained unanswered. The destruction of the order was meant to be absolute. Arrests, trials, executions, and confiscations were designed to erase the Templars from history as thoroughly as possible. Yet history rarely obeys such intentions. When an institution is dismantled, its people do not simply vanish. They adapt, disperse, and survive in ways that official records struggle to capture. Not every Templar was arrested. Not every region acted with the same urgency or brutality. Outside France, the response was uneven. In England, the arrests were slower, the accusations met with skepticism. Torture was used sparingly. Many Templars were found guilty of nothing more than association. Some were pensioned off. Others were absorbed into monasteries or allowed to live quietly under supervision. In the Iberian Peninsula, where the Reconquista still shaped priorities, the Templars were considered useful. Their military experience mattered more than accusations imported from France. In Portugal, King Denis refused to persecute them outright. Instead, he dissolved the order in name only and reconstituted its members as the Order of Christ. Their properties remained intact. Their identity shifted, but their continuity was preserved. This pattern repeated elsewhere. In Aragon, many Templars were integrated into new or existing military orders. In Scotland, where King Robert the Bruce was excommunicated and hostile to papal authority, enforcement was lax. Legends later claimed Templars fought at Bannockburn, aiding the Scottish cause. Whether true or not, the story reflects a broader truth. Enforcement depended on political alignment. Where the Church's authority was weakest, the Templars survived most easily. Survival, however, did not mean visibility. The men who had lived under strict discipline now learned discretion of a different kind. They shed symbols, adopted new roles, and blended into civilian life. Some became farmers, craftsmen, or clerks. Others joined guilds, monastic communities, or royal administrations. Their skills were valuable. Their pasts were quietly ignored. The bonds they shared did not dissolve so easily. Brotherhood forged through years of shared hardship does not disappear with a decree. It changes form. Communication became indirect. Recognition subtle. Symbols, if used at all, were disguised or reinterpreted. This quiet continuity fueled later speculation. Stories emerged of secret meetings, hidden networks, and coded signs passed down through generations. Some of these stories were undoubtedly exaggerated. Others may have contained kernels of truth. When documentation vanishes, imagination fills the void. What is certain is that Templar influence did not end with the order's suppression. Their administrative methods, financial practices, and organizational discipline lived on in institutions that absorbed them. The Church itself benefited from their expertise even as it condemned their name. This contradiction was rarely acknowledged. Over time, the idea of Templar survival took on a mythic quality. It suggested that the order had transcended its physical form, that it had become something more elusive and therefore more powerful. For those who believed the Templars had guarded forbidden knowledge, survival was essential. Knowledge, once learned, cannot be unlearned. Even if texts were destroyed, understanding could persist in memory and practice. The disappearance of the order may have protected that knowledge rather than extinguished it. Silence became camouflage. Later movements, fraternal organizations, and secret societies would be linked, sometimes loosely, sometimes implausibly, to the Templars. Freemasonry, in particular, attracted such associations. Its emphasis on symbolism, secrecy, and moral development resonated with the romantic image of the Templars. Historians caution against direct lineage. There is little concrete evidence that medieval Templars became early Freemasons. But cultural inheritance does not require bloodlines. Ideas can migrate independently of institutions. The Templars became a template. They represented an ideal of disciplined brotherhood, moral commitment, and resistance to arbitrary authority. In periods of social upheaval, such ideals find new expressions. The Church, perhaps unwittingly, contributed to this transformation. By destroying the order so publicly, it elevated the Templars from historical actors to symbols. Symbols are difficult to control. They adapt to the needs of those who invoke them. For some, the surviving Templars represented defiance. For others, continuity. For still others, mystery. The reality was likely less dramatic, but no less human. Men who had lost everything rebuilt quietly. They carried memories of injustice, of loyalty tested, of faith complicated by betrayal. Those memories shaped their lives and, indirectly, the communities they joined. Survival also carried a burden. To live on was to accept the loss of public identity. The Red Cross could no longer be worn openly. The rule could no longer be followed as before. What remained was internal. Discipline, memory, belief. In this sense, the Templars' survival mirrored the nature of the forbidden knowledge attributed to them. Both retreated inward. Both resisted documentation. Both persisted quietly. Centuries later, historians would search archives for traces of this survival. They would find fragments. Unusual transfers of property, cryptic references, sudden disappearances. Enough to suggest continuity, but never enough to confirm it. This ambiguity has kept the question alive. Did the Templars survive as an organized secret network? Probably not in the way legend imagines. Did they survive as individuals carrying forward a shared identity? Almost certainly. The distinction matters. Organized conspiracies require constant coordination. They leave evidence. Cultural memory does not. It seeps into behavior, values, and stories. The Church succeeded in destroying the order as a legal entity. It did not succeed in erasing its human core. That core found refuge wherever authority was weak, wherever usefulness outweighed suspicion, wherever memory mattered more than obedience. In Portugal, the transformation into the Order of Christ preserved not only property, but purpose. That order would later play a crucial role in the age of exploration. Ships bearing the Red Cross sailed beyond known maps, carrying Europe into a new era. The irony is striking. An order accused of hoarding forbidden knowledge became, through its successor, a catalyst for discovery. Exploration replaced crusade. Curiosity replaced conquest. The Templars did not survive unchanged. But survival rarely means stasis. They survived by dissolving into the world they had once served, leaving behind traces rather than structures. Their story continued not as a chapter, but as an undercurrent. And in that undercurrent, the idea persisted that something had escaped destruction, not through defiance but through adaptation. The order was gone. The brothers were not. Long after the last fires burned out and the official records fell silent, stone began to speak. Not through words, but through symbols carved into walls, arches, and ceilings. Symbols that seemed out of place, out of time, and strangely familiar to those who knew where to look. Nowhere did this silent language appear more provocatively than in Scotland, a land already steeped in defiance, exile, and unfinished history. Scotland occupied a unique position during the fall of the Templars. King Robert the Bruce was excommunicated by the Church, locked in his own struggle against English domination. Papal authority held little practical power within his realm. Where France moved swiftly to arrest and destroy, Scotland hesitated, or simply ignored Rome's demands. This hesitation would later become fertile ground for legend. Stories emerged that Templars fleeing persecution found refuge in Scotland, that they brought with them not armies or treasure, but knowledge and identity, that they fought alongside Bruce at Bannockburn, turning the tide of battle in 1314. There is no contemporary proof of this, but the story persisted because it felt symbolically true. Scotland was a place for those who had fallen out of favor with centralized power. More compelling than battlefield legends, however, were the stones. Rosslyn Chapel, built in the mid-15th century by William Sinclair, stands at the heart of this mystery. At first glance, it appears to be a richly decorated Christian chapel, its interior dense with carvings so intricate they seem almost excessive. But closer examination reveals something unusual. Symbols that do not belong to conventional medieval Christian iconography appear again and again. Geometric patterns repeat with obsessive precision. Columns twist in ways more symbolic than structural. Carvings resemble plants unknown in Europe at the time. Maize, aloe, even forms that would not be officially encountered until centuries later. Whether these interpretations are literal or imaginative, the effect is undeniable. Rosslyn feels encoded. Templar symbols appear throughout the chapel. The red cross, the double square, the five-pointed star. Individually, these symbols can be explained. Together, they suggest intentional reference. The Sinclairs themselves were closely linked to knightly traditions and later Masonic lore, further deepening the association. What makes Rosslyn so unsettling is not any single symbol, but the density of them. It feels less like decoration and more like preservation. Stone used as memory. If the Templars had survived in fragmented form, unable to write openly, architecture would have been an ideal vessel. Stone does not betray under torture. Symbols can hide in plain sight. Meaning can be layered, accessible only to those trained to read it. Architecture becomes scripture. The circular motifs found in Templar churches across Europe reappear here, echoed in proportion and alignment. Sacred geometry, ratios believed to reflect divine order, governs the chapel's design. This geometry was not unique to the Templars, but their fascination with it was pronounced. Geometry offered a way to express spiritual truth without words. Such expression was safe, could not be easily condemned. The Church was accustomed to regulating text and ritual. It was far less adept at policing symbolism embedded in stone. Once a chapel was built and consecrated, its carvings became part of the sacred landscape. To accuse them of heresy would require interpretation, and interpretation invited questions. Scotland offered distance as well as defiance. Far from Rome, far from Paris, it allowed ideas to persist without scrutiny. Whether or not Templars were directly involved in Rosslyn's construction, The chapel embodies the kind of memory a displaced order might leave behind. Not a manifesto, a whisper. Symbols similar to those at Rosslyn appear elsewhere in Scotland. Grave markers, remote churches, isolated towers. Each instance alone is inconclusive. Together, they suggest a pattern of transmission rather than coincidence. The question is not whether the Templars built these structures, but whether their worldview influenced those who did. Influence is harder to trace than authorship. The language of symbols thrives in cultures shaped by secrecy and survival. Scotland, with its clan systems, oral traditions, and resistance to centralized authority, was fertile ground for such language. Meaning could be preserved without exposure. Identity could endure without announcement. Over time, this symbolic inheritance would blend with emerging traditions. Freemasonry, which took root in Scotland earlier and more visibly than elsewhere, inherited a deep respect for geometry, symbolism, and moral allegory. Its rituals emphasized inner transformation, secrecy, and brotherhood, values long associated with the romanticized image of the Templars. Again, direct lineage is difficult to prove, but cultural resonance does not require documentation. Rosslyn Chapel later became a focal point for these associations. Writers, historians, and seekers projected onto it their own questions about lost knowledge and suppressed truth. Some claims stretched credibility. Others touched something genuine, a sense that this place held more than it revealed. The Church never fully addressed these symbols. It neither endorsed nor condemned them. Silence prevailed. Silence once again protected ambiguity. What Rosslyn represents ultimately is possibility. The possibility that the Templars' end was not absolute. That their ideas, values, or questions survived by migrating into forms less vulnerable than institutions. Stone, symbol, and story proved more durable than orders and decrees. This migration would explain why no single treasure was ever found. Why no definitive document emerged. The legacy was not meant to be uncovered like a chest buried in earth. It was meant to be lived, interpreted, and reimagined. Scotland's role in this legacy is not one of certainty, but of shelter. A place where fragments could rest undisturbed, where memory could be reshaped rather than erased. Even today, visitors to Rosslyn Chapel describe an atmosphere of quiet intensity. Not fear, not awe alone, but concentration, as if the space demands attention. This reaction is not proof of secret knowledge, but it suggests intentional design. Architecture that invites contemplation rather than instruction. That invitation mirrors the deepest anxiety the Church once felt toward the Templars. Not that they taught the wrong answers, but that they encouraged the wrong kind of questions. Stone, unlike doctrine, does not dictate belief. It offers patterns. It invites interpretation. It places responsibility on the observer. In that sense, Rosslyn Chapel may be the most enduring expression of the Templars' forbidden legacy, not because it reveals their secret, but because it preserves their method. Silence, symbol, and the refusal to explain. Fire was meant to cleanse. That was the logic behind the executions, the trials, the destruction of documents and lives. Flames were supposed to purify the faith by erasing what was deemed corrupt. Yet history offers a different lesson. Fire destroys bodies and paper, but it rarely destroys ideas. Often it strengthens them. Whatever the Templars knew or were believed to know did not vanish with the order. The intensity of the effort to eradicate them ensured the opposite. The more violently they were silenced, the more compelling their silence became. Questions that might have faded were instead preserved by fear. This is the paradox of suppression. Had the Church allowed the Templars to dissolve quietly, their story might have ended as a footnote. Instead, the spectacle of accusation and execution transformed them into a mystery. Mystery invites inquiry. Inquiry resists control. The forbidden knowledge associated with the Templars did not survive as doctrine or text. It survived as implication, as a sense that something had been threatened deeply enough to require annihilation. That sense alone was powerful. What survived was not a list of beliefs, but a pattern. The pattern appears wherever authority reacts with disproportionate force. When institutions choose destruction over dialogue, they reveal their fear. And fear signals vulnerability. The Templars' silence under torture, their refusal to explain symbols, their willingness to die rather than comply, all of this suggested that whatever they held was not easily articulated, but deeply internalized. It was not something that could be confiscated or corrected, could only be denied. And denial failed. Across centuries, the idea that the Templars guarded a truth beyond official doctrine resurfaced again and again. Writers, philosophers, and seekers returned to the same questions. Why were they destroyed so completely? Why were the accusations so focused on belief rather than action? Why did the Church avoid clarity? Each generation reframed the mystery to fit its own concerns. Enlightenment thinkers saw in the Templars a symbol of reason crushed by dogma. Romantic writers imagined them as guardians of ancient wisdom. Modern historians approach the story with caution, yet still acknowledge its unresolved nature. The knowledge that survived was not uniform. It fragmented, adapted, and blended with new contexts. It appeared in architecture, in ritual, in literature, not as proof but as possibility. Possibility is resilient. The Church attempted to control memory by controlling narrative. Official histories reduced the Templars to criminals or victims of political intrigue. But official histories rarely satisfy. They close doors without explaining what lies behind them. The Templar story left too many doors closed too forcefully. In every age, there are groups that internalize belief rather than broadcast it. They value discipline, reflection, and silence. They resist reduction. The Templars became a prototype for such groups, whether or not direct influence existed. The forbidden knowledge, in this sense, was not a specific revelation. It was an approach to faith and meaning that prioritized inner transformation over external authority. That approach cannot be destroyed by fire, can be discouraged, can be marginalized, but it persists wherever individuals ask questions without waiting for permission. The Church's fear, then, was not misplaced. It correctly sensed a threat not to doctrine but to monopoly. The Templars embodied the idea that devotion could be self-governed, that loyalty could exist without constant supervision. Such an idea undermines any institution built on mediation. This is why the suppression was so thorough. Partial measures would not suffice. Reform would leave remnants. Debate would legitimize alternatives. Only erasure promised safety. Yet erasure failed because meaning cannot be erased externally. The very act of suppression created a negative space in history, a silence that begged to be filled. In that silence, imagination flourished. And imagination, once engaged, becomes memory. What survived was not the Templar's secret, but the awareness that secrets exist. This awareness shaped later skepticism toward absolute authority. It encouraged the belief that official narratives might conceal as much as they reveal. Planted doubt, not destructive doubt, but reflective doubt. In this way, the Templars contributed to a slow shift in consciousness. Not immediately, not dramatically, but persistently. Their story became a cautionary tale about power and fear, about what happens when institutions choose certainty over humility, about the cost of silencing complexity. The forbidden knowledge was never fully articulated because it did not need to be. Its survival depended on being unspoken. Once spoken, it could be categorized, debated, dismissed. Unspoken, it remained untouchable. Even today, discussions of the Templars often reveal more about the present than the past. We project onto them our own tensions between authority and autonomy, tradition and inquiry, faith and understanding. That projection is not accidental. The Templars occupy a liminal space in history. They stand at the intersection of devotion and doubt, obedience and independence. They remind us that belief has always been contested terrain. Fire could not destroy that reminder. The Church tried to bury the Templars beneath accusations, trials, and ashes. Instead, it elevated them into a question that has never been answered definitively. What did they know? The question itself is the legacy, because it invites reflection on how truth is defined, who controls it, and what happens when it escapes. The forbidden knowledge survived not as content, but as challenge. A challenge to every institution that claims exclusive authority. A challenge that whispers rather than shouts. A challenge that asks, quietly and persistently, whether faith and understanding might be deeper, broader, and more personal than any single structure allows. And that is why it could not be burned. Absolutely. Here is Section 21 expanded to 1100 plus words, written entirely in English without headings or section numbers, and presented in clean paragraph form, matching the same cinematic, reflective, history-for-sleep tone as the previous sections. Fire was meant to cleanse. That was the logic behind the executions, the trials, the destruction of documents, and the deliberate erasure of memory. Flames were supposed to purify the faith by consuming what had been labeled corrupt. Yet history offers a different lesson, one repeated across centuries. Fire destroys bodies and paper, but it rarely destroys ideas. More often, it gives them permanence. Whatever the Templars knew, or whatever the Church feared they knew, did not vanish with the collapse of the order. The sheer intensity of the campaign against them ensured the opposite result. The more violently they were silenced, the more compelling their silence became. Questions that might have faded into obscurity were preserved precisely because they were forbidden. This is the paradox of suppression. When an institution responds to uncertainty with annihilation rather than understanding, it reveals fear. And fear leaves traces. The trials did not resolve doubt. They concentrated it. Accusations were made, confessions extracted, judgments rendered, yet clarity never followed. Instead, ambiguity hardened. The Templars were condemned, but the reasons remained fragmented, inconsistent, and unresolved. The Church declared victory, but history remained unsettled. What survived was not a doctrine, a relic, or a hidden manuscript. It was a pattern, a way of seeing. The pattern emerges whenever authority reacts with overwhelming force to perceived internal threat. It appears when belief is policed rather than explored, when questions are framed as crimes, and when silence is treated as guilt. In these moments, the act of suppression becomes more revealing than the alleged transgression. The Templars' endurance under torture remains one of the most disturbing elements of their story. Men confessed under pain, recanted when free, and some refused to speak at all, even at the cost of their lives. This behavior is difficult to explain if the secret they guarded was trivial or false. People will die for belief. They rarely die for lies. Their silence was not empty. It was deliberate. The forbidden knowledge, whatever its precise form, was not something that could be easily translated into courtroom language. It was not a list of propositions or a single heretical claim. It appears instead to have been a way of understanding faith, one that emphasized internal conviction over external enforcement, discipline over display, meaning over ritual. Such an approach threatens institutions that rely on mediation. The Church's authority depended on its role as interpreter and gatekeeper. Faith flowed downward, structured, supervised, and regulated. The idea that devotion could exist independently, contained within a disciplined community, governed by conscience rather than constant oversight, was destabilizing. The Templars embodied that possibility. They did not preach alternative doctrine. They did not recruit followers from the laity. They did not challenge the Church publicly. Their threat was quieter and therefore more dangerous. They demonstrated that belief could be lived rather than administered. That demonstration could not be tolerated. The attempt to burn the Templars out of history created a negative space, a silence that invited reflection. Where explanations should have been, there were ashes. Where clarity was promised, there was contradiction. This absence became fertile ground for memory, speculation, and inquiry. Over centuries, this silence attracted meaning. Philosophers, writers, and historians returned to the same unresolved questions. Why did the Church move so decisively? Why were the accusations so focused on belief rather than behavior? Why was reform never seriously attempted? Why destruction instead of dialogue? Each era found its own answers, shaped by its own struggles with authority. The Enlightenment saw in the Templars an example of reason crushed by dogma. Romanticism cast them as tragic guardians of ancient wisdom. Modern scholarship approaches with caution, yet still acknowledges the extraordinary nature of their eradication. What persists across interpretations is unease. The forbidden knowledge survived not as content, but as challenge. It became the suggestion that institutions do not merely protect truth, they define it. And that definition, once challenged, provokes fear. The Templar story contributed to a broader shift in how authority was perceived. Not immediately, not consciously, but gradually. It reinforced the idea that official narratives deserve scrutiny, that power and truth are not always aligned, and that silence may sometimes indicate integrity rather than guilt. This influence is subtle but enduring. The forbidden knowledge also survived in symbol rather than speech. In architecture, in ritual, in coded language, and in the persistent allure of secrecy itself. Symbols are resilient because they resist closure. They invite interpretation without offering final answers. This quality mirrors the Templars' legacy perfectly. They left no manifesto, no confession that clarified everything. What they left was uncertainty, and uncertainty is powerful. It refuses to be settled, keeps history alive rather than complete. The Church attempted to end the story. Instead, it ensured its continuation. The fire that consumed the Templars' bodies did not illuminate their beliefs, cast shadows, and in those shadows, imagination, doubt, and reflection flourished. The forbidden knowledge became less about what was known and more about what could not be controlled. That is why it endured, because the most dangerous knowledge is not a secret text or hidden relic. It is the realization that truth does not belong exclusively to institutions. It lives wherever individuals question, reflect, and seek understanding beyond prescribed boundaries. That realization cannot be burned, cannot be confiscated, cannot be erased. And that, perhaps, is the secret the Church feared most, not what the Templars believed, but what their existence implied. That faith, once internalized, becomes untouchable, and history, once questioned, never fully returns to silence.